Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Thursday, July 25th, 2024 special meeting of the Boulder City Council. It's wonderful to have you all here. I hope you enjoyed a few weeks without meetings, and good to have you back and all of us together again. So I will go ahead and call us to order and ask Alicia to do roll call, please.
Let me see if I remember how to do that. No. Hello, everybody, and good evening. And as the mayor has said, welcome back. We'll start tonight's roll call as usual with Councilmember Adams.
Present.
Benjamin.
Present.
Mayor Brockett.
Present.
Councilmember Folkerts.
Present.
Marquis.
Present.
Shuhar.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Spear.
Present.
Councilmember Wallach.
I am here.
And Weiner.
Present.
Mayor, the band is back together and we have our quorum.
All right, back together. Very good. Well, this being a special meeting, we will launch right into the consent agenda, please, Alicia.
Yes, sir. The consent agenda is item number 2 on the agenda, and it consists of items 2A through 2E.
Great. Any questions or comments on the consent agenda? Or possibly a motion?
Move to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Got a motion and a second, and I think can we specify, Nicole, that perhaps including the amendment sent on hotline this afternoon?
Yes, I will amend my motion to include the amendments that were sent out on hotline this afternoon.
Thanks so much. So we have a motion and a second. I think we can move straight to a vote. Alicia, can you do a roll call, please?
Yes, sir. Thank you. The roll call for the consent agenda items 2A through 2E will begin tonight with Councilmember Wallach.
Aye.
Weiner.
Yes.
Adams.
Yes.
Benjamin.
Yes.
Mayor Brockett.
Yes.
Councilmember Folkerts.
Yes.
Marquis.
Yes.
Shuhar.
Yes.
And Mayor Pro Tem Spear.
Yes.
The consent agenda is hereby approved unanimously.
Good. And I'll just mention regarding 2D about chronic nuisances, we have gotten some emails from organizations this afternoon, and I just know that we'll be continuing the community conversation as we move towards the second reading and public hearing. And if we can go to the call-up check-in, please.
Yes, sir. Our call-up check-ins are item number 3 on tonight's agenda. 3A is the landmark alteration certificate application to construct an approximately 200 square foot third floor addition and roof deck at 2040 14th Street. This is referenced under HIS 2024-00085 in the downtown historic district pursuant to section 9-11-18 of the Boulder Revised Code 1981 and under the procedures prescribed by chapter 1-3 quasi-judicial hearings, BRC 1981. The owner is 2040 Boulder LLC. Registered agent Aaron Grant / applicant is, Nijiba Zoda and Andy Ali, Design Edge Architecture.
Any questions or comments or desire to call this up? I'm seeing only shaking heads, so looks like not. We will not call this one up. All right, we have 2 matters from the city manager. The first one is 5A. Alicia, if you can take us to that, please.
Thank you, sir. 5A is the training and pre-update overview of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan.
Thank you, E and council members. It's that time again, that wonderful time where we get to talk about comp plan. And while we are going to talk in earnest about our comp plan soon, we thought we'd take a moment, and we thank you for allowing us to have this time to sort of talk about it as a primer a little bit. I know not everyone has been through a comprehensive plan, and our PNDS team really thought it was important to be able to answer any questions, have some clarity. So Brad, with that, I will send it to you.
Thank you so very much, Nuria, and welcome back, council members. It is true. Comprehensive planning provides a unique opportunity in a jurisdiction's history. It's really one of the rare opportunities to step back and think about the vision that the community wants to imagine for itself in the next 15 or 20 years. And interestingly, while it regulates, it is not regulatory. Its policies are aspirational, and they reflect the challenges of considering and stating what must necessarily sometimes be competing values, which is kind of like what we experience in life ourselves. For example, trails and water quality features are both important and often want to be in the same physical space, and they can both be values expressed in a comprehensive plan. So tonight we'll be providing an overview of what comprehensive plans are in general, why they're done, and what the rich history of Boulder's historic land use planning has been in that spirit of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. And we really look forward to sharing what is just the beginning, if I may call it that, of a conversation with you in the community, and is really intended to be just a foundation for a more in-depth discussion next month. So with those thoughts, I'm going to turn it over to Christopher Johnson, the city's comprehensive planning senior manager, for a couple other thoughts as we go into the presentation.
Thank you, Brad, and good evening, Council. Christopher Johnson, Comprehensive Planning Manager. And I wanted to just provide a few comments this evening before we get going, knowing that we have a more in-depth study session scheduled with you in a joint session with Planning Board coming up on August 22nd. So a short 4 weeks away. Tonight's presentation really is intended to be informational for you, to provide some background on comprehensive plans in general and the history of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. We will tease just a little bit in terms of what our process overall kind of looks like and schedule for that going forward, but hopefully we can defer any really detailed questions on the process itself until August 22nd. And certainly we are here this evening to provide any clarifying comments and answer any questions you may have on the comprehensive plan in general, and sort of how it functions today, some of the historical pieces to it, and can certainly answer questions on if they're relatively high level related to the process itself. But hopefully we will have the opportunity to really dive into the details of the scope and schedule and our engagement strategy coming up here in August. So with that, I will pass it off to my colleagues in comprehensive planning, Chris Ranglos and Tess Shorn. Thank you.
Good evening, Council. I'll start by introducing myself while we pull the presentation up. My name is Chris Ranglos. I'm a senior planner in comprehensive planning, and presenting with me tonight is Tess Shorn, who's also a city planner with our work group as well. And as KJ had mentioned, this is really an opportunity for our staff to share a bit of an overview of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. Our goal is to help develop a foundational understanding of the BVCP, its intent, various components, as well as share a bit of its history prior to the official kickoff later this fall. Our staff will be back on August 22nd for a joint session with you, City Council, as well as the Planning Board, to share out and seek feedback on the draft scope, schedule, and our draft community engagement plan. Next slide. Quick rundown of the agenda. We'll talk a little bit about comprehensive plans in general, share a little bit about Boulder Valley's comprehensive plan and some of the unique traits that we find within it. And then Tess is going to give us a bit of an overview of the history of our comprehensive plan and some of the key milestones that have led us to where we are today. And then we'll jump into and preview a little bit of the process that we expect to go through and what the next steps are. And we'll start here with Colorado state regulations, and just want to make it known that the state of Colorado does require the adoption of a comprehensive plan for any municipality with a population over 2,000. The state encourages that the principal purpose is to be a guide for the achievement of community goals, and plan elements that address recreation and tourism, including water supply and water conservation, as well as strategic growth, are required by state statutes. And we'll start by just asking the question, what is a comprehensive plan? And as Brad had alluded to, a comprehensive plan is really a high-level visionary plan to help guide a city's future. These plans are based on long-standing community values that help to guide how cities will grow into the future. They typically include topics such as land use and transportation and parks and open space, though as you'll see in our comprehensive plan, this is certainly not an exhaustive list. And philosophically, why do we do comprehensive plans? Why do we adopt comprehensive plans? And really we do this to maintain aspirational goals for a desired future with at least a 15-year time horizon. They help us to weigh trade-offs and make difficult decisions, to be deliberate and intentional about how we grow and tackle new and emerging needs in our communities. They provide a unifying policy framework of which key decisions in our community can be weighed against. And really, at the end of the day, we want our community to shape its future. It's very much of a community-driven plan, and it presents an opportunity to come together as one Boulder, to make tough decisions, important decisions, and be deliberate about our future. And hopefully at the end of the day, achieve the intended outcomes that we as a community collectively hope to achieve. A comprehensive plan is not intended to be a fine-grained regulatory document, as Brad had also mentioned. And that fine-grained level of detailed planning and regulatory items are achieved in small area or sub-community plans, as well as through zoning and municipal codes. And with this type of plan, again, we really are at that 30,000-foot view, a very visionary and aspirational document. Jumping into our comprehensive plan here in the Boulder Valley, or BVCP, as it is often referred to as, this is the jointly adopted and governing long-range planning document for the Boulder Valley, and that includes both the city of Boulder as well as land in unincorporated Boulder County. It guides long-range planning decisions on growth, the built and natural environment, transportation, climate, economy, housing, and community well-being and safety. Taking a look at the overall planning framework and really where this fits in, the BVCP is aligned with and informed by our sustainability, equity, and resilience framework, and it also informs the citywide strategic plan. It sets the broader policy goals that are then distilled into action-based regulatory documents like subcommunity and area plans, department plans, various citywide strategies, development standards, and zoning. And it also influences budgeting and resourcing across the organization, including within the city's annual capital improvement program, as well as the operating budget. And I'll spend a bit of time on this slide as there's a lot to talk about as far as the relationship and the role that the county has with this as well. I will point out that the county does have their own comprehensive plan, which is very well aligned to that of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, and again governs all unincorporated lands outside of the Boulder Valley. And the city and county have a long-standing tradition of working together really since the inception of the first Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan in 1977, which was really centered around guiding growth in the Boulder Valley in a positive way. The 1977 plan is also when the city and county entered into an intergovernmental agreement, which stipulated that both the city and the county would follow the plan, the land use map, as well as the policies regarding utility provision and new urban development, which really was intended to only occur in areas with a full range of urban services. And since then, there has been a fairly consistent framework, vision, and values around growth management, as well as urban service provision. And while this framework and vision for guiding growth in the Boulder Valley has remained stable for 50 years, the plan's policies and procedures have certainly evolved. And it's important to note that within the BVCP, there are city-specific policies where it says the city shall versus the city and county shall. And policies that say the city shall only apply to the city, whereas those policies that mention both the city and the county apply to both. And the last thing I want to point out on this slide is that the approval of the BVCP is a four-body decision, meaning that the city and county will need to work together and ultimately, at the end of the day, approve the same plan. And I'll spend a bit of time on this slide too, but I want to walk through some of the components of the BVCP, and we'll start here with the service area framework, or the area 1, 2, and 3 planning areas, as it is often referred to as. And again, this framework is the result of the 1977 BVCP, which sought to establish a new intergovernmental tool between the city and the county to help guide growth in the Boulder Valley. And essentially what this framework does is it sets a standard and expectation that urban development only occur in areas that are served by urban services or within city limits, while allowing the remaining areas of the Boulder Valley to remain rural. And this was established to limit sprawl, preserve the rural buffer between the city and adjacent communities, to maintain a well-defined city edge, prevent patterns of leapfrog development, and ultimately to maintain the compact nature of our community. And I'll walk through the colors on the map here for a brief moment. Area 1, or the yellow that you see here on the slide, is the city limits proper, which has adequate urban facilities and services. And again, this is where we want to drive urban development to occur. Area 2, which is the gray sort of fringe bubbles that you see around the city, are areas that are now under county jurisdiction, where annexation into the city is anticipated so long as that growth is consistent with P. And it's important to note that area 1 and 2 together make up what we call the service area, another term that you may hear referenced often. And we'll jump into area 3. Area 3 is going to be the majority of the green that you see here on the slide. And this is the remaining area within the Boulder Valley that is generally under county jurisdiction and is intended to remain rural without urban facilities and services. And area 3 is divided into 2 separate areas. The first one, which is the majority of the green that you see here, is the area 3 rural preservation area. And this is where the city and county intend to preserve the existing rural land uses and character. And then the second part of area 3 is the little bubble that you see just north of town. This is the area 3 planning reserve. This is where the city and county intend to maintain the option of future service area expansion. And as you know, city staff are currently preparing an urban services study, which is the first step of evaluating whether expansion into the planning reserve is feasible and should be considered. The full range of urban services and standards to serve development is defined in the BVCP as well, and the city is the preferred provider of these urban services. And these standards are intended to be minimum requirements or thresholds for services that must be delivered to existing urban development, new development, and for redevelopment to be considered adequate. Jumping into the land use map, which is in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, describes the future land uses and character that help to shape the development and redevelopment by establishing aspirational and broad future land use patterns across the Boulder Valley. And we currently utilize this under these land use designations under a couple of different categories, including residential, industrial, business, open space, and other. And there are 26 different land use designations within these categories. And it's important to be able to distinguish between land use and zoning, which are oftentimes confused as they may appear very similar. And so essentially land use, again, is visionary, it's forward-looking, and it's aspirational in nature. It describes the community's vision and desired uses across the Boulder Valley. It may or may not be the same use than the existing use that is there today. And the land use map informs future zoning and rezoning decisions in order to bring both land use and zoning into alignment. Zoning, on the other hand, is a legal property right, and it sets more specific development-related standards than land use does. It includes regulations around allowed uses, building form, and intensity of development. And the two do need to speak to one another. So if I can provide a metaphor to hopefully break this down a little bit easier for folks, I like to think of a birthday cake. So the land use is going to describe the desired cake, like a chocolate cake, where zoning is the recipe or the steps that we need to follow in order to make that chocolate cake. And if we don't get the recipe right or the zoning right to match the chocolate cake or the land use, then we may end up with a cake that we didn't intend to make. Talk a little bit about sub-community and area planning. The city's broken down into 10 geographic sub-communities that provide more focused areas of study and provides a framework for managing change and implementing BVCP policy at a more local level within the city. And this essentially helps translate large-scale planning ideas that are expressed in the BVCP to a more localized and human scale. Adopted sub-community plans consist of the North Boulder sub-community plan in 1995 and the most recent East Boulder sub-community plan. And an example of the most recently adopted area plans include the Transit Village area plan for the Boulder Junction area and the Alpine Balsam area plan for the former BCH site and future Western City campus. And I'll point out as well that all sub-community and area plans are influenced by the policies that are established within the BVCP and are one of the key implementation tools in realizing its vision. And a key culture of the BVCP is that we regularly update it. It's not a plan that gets written, it sits on a shelf and collects dust and then completely rewritten. Our BVCP is a living vision document for our city, and it continues to evolve and change with the changing needs of our community. And since the 1977 BVCP, we've had 7 major updates on an established regular schedule to ensure the vision and needs of our community continue to be met. It's reviewed every 5 years for possible amendments to reflect changes in circumstances and community desires, with major updates happening every 10 years. And the most recent major update, occurred in 2015, which Tess will provide some additional information on shortly after discussing some of our key planning milestones. With that, I will pass it over to Tess. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tess Shorn, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history pre the first BVCP. So since the 1977, Boulder Valley has undoubtedly changed, but 2 important factors that shape the urban form of Boulder are its mountain backdrop and surrounding open space and rural lands. Boulder's distinctive sense of place and compact size did not happen by accident. I will be sharing some history of what got us to comprehensive planning in Boulder Valley. So when talking about Boulder Valley's growth over the last few centuries, we must first acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who traversed, lived, and stewarded lands in Boulder Valley since time immemorial. These indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. We honor and respect the people of these nations and their ancestors. The city of Boulder recognizes that those now living and working on these ancestral lands have a responsibility to acknowledge and address the past. The city refutes past justifications for colonialization of indigenous lands and acknowledges a legacy of oppression that has caused intergenerational trauma to indigenous peoples and families. And moving forward a little bit in history, Boulder began proper as a mining town and then grew slowly, opening the University of Colorado in 1877, and for a long time remained kind of that small college town. However, between 1950 and 1970, Boulder's population more than tripled, growing from 20,000 to almost 67,000. Because of this rapid population growth, community members grew concerned about the sprawl continuing into the mountains. So in 1959, the Blue Line was added to the city charter as a tool to limit the sprawl. It restricts city water and sewer services on the west edge of the city. On the heels of the institution of this Blue Line, the Boulder community sought to preserve open space lands around the city, and in 1967, Boulder became the first city in the nation to institute a dedicated sales tax to purchase open space lands. And this approach to growth management and rural land preservation was further defined with the adoption of the service areas, which Chris talked about previously, by the city and county in the 1977 Boulder Comprehensive Plan. This has been a fundamental framework for focusing growth within the city limits ever since. The impacts can be seen here as city-owned open space has been purchased and preserved over the last 50 years. While community members during this time were concerned about growing outward, there was also an increased concern over growing upward. A few development proposals were submitted that included 100-foot tall buildings, and community members were concerned about preserving views to the mountains and overall Boulder's character. So voters passed a change to the city's charter to institute a 55-foot height limit in 1971. And this height limit was actually based on the height of a mature cottonwood tree. Since the 70s, much of the city's growth management has occurred through the BVCP. However, that is not the only focus in the more recent major updates. And now I'm going to talk about the most recent major update, which was the 2015 major update. So the vision in 2015 was the Boulder Valley community honors its history and legacy of planning for a livable community surrounded by open space and rural lands, while striving together to create and preserve a truly special place that is sustainable, resilient, equitable, and inclusive, now and for generations to come. So in this statement, you can still kind of hear the growth management that occurred back in the 70s as well. The culmination of the community process during this major update led staff to these 7 focus areas in 2015. These focus areas include housing affordability and diversity, growth, design quality and placemaking, small local business, resilience and climate commitment, sub-communities and area planning, and arts and culture. And I just want to highlight that these focus areas are subject to change with the community process moving forward in this next major update. In the 2015 BVCP, there was also lots of policies, and they were organized into topic areas. So how do these policies function? Well, one really important factor is that not one single policy is currently prioritized over another. All policies are weighed carefully, and trade-off choices among the policies is sometimes necessary. And as a reminder, some of the policies are specific to the city and some apply to both the city and county. And this reinforces the value of joint adoption and the 4-body review process. And now for exciting news, we're looking forward to the 2025 major update. So what can be done during a major update? And the answer is pretty much most things. So all maps can be updated, all criteria for urban services, all policies, any of those things can be updated during a major update. And we will be kicking off this major update later this fall. And because so much can be changed and adjusted during a major update, I want to reiterate that the BVCP is a reflection of our community, who we are and who we want to be in the future. A plan of this magnitude and importance to the community requires a lot of time with the community, which we anticipate spending nearly all of 2025 doing. We will be engaging in conversation with our community to answer many key questions and decide together what our vision for the next 20 years is. We hope to proceed with a draft plan and hold public hearings for the adoption in mid to late 2026. But speaking of engagement, we will be sharing our overall engagement strategy with you in August, and we plan to engage the community in a variety of ways. Today, we just want to highlight our plans to stand up a community assembly, which is both our greatest engagement innovation in this process and also our deepest level of engagement. There is 2 main components to assembly: the random selection process and the in-depth deliberation for the group to arrive at judgments that balance competing values such as freedom of choice and fairness to different social groups. We have engaged a consultant to support us throughout the design and implementation, and in August, we will share many more details about this process. We will ensure the community assembly complements all other engagement strategies we employ. The BVCP is a citywide effort, which policies and land use decisions affect many other departments. Thus, we will also work internally to ensure all necessary departments are provided input and assist in assisting the creation of the major update. So next steps, we will be back in front of you August 22nd with a draft scope, schedule, and engagement strategy. which will really get into the meat of this next major update. And then we plan to have the community-wide kickoff of the update on October 19th. Thank you all so much for listening to this presentation. And now we'd like to open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that very informative presentation and the overview of our rich history of planning here in the city of Boulder. Do we have questions for city staff on the update to the BBCP? I've got Taisha.
Yes, thank you so much. And really exciting to be a part of this process. Again, just, reminding folks that planning can be a very wonderful thing if you're planned for. And it could be a very hard thing if you're used for planning. And so I'm excited to be both at the table and still on the menu. As an African American person here and multiple other identities, and so I'm excited about this more participatory thing. But I had a question about our consultants, and curious if we're hiring local experts. I'm also curious about the racial socioeconomic representation of the leadership on these things. I've noticed some of our consulting groups are not always reflective of our fullest community and the communities that we serve as, and it's not always connected with our commitment to ensuring that we are partnering with our local experts, similar in the way that we do when we're talking about economic policy, and we partner with the EU, right? And we do all of these things. So I'm hopeful that in this community engagement where we have tons of local experts. So I'm curious about that team in particular, and if local experts are being engaged. And then I'd raised this issue around the 40 participants or the number, and I'm just curious if there had been any more conversation around how those folks would be identified. And again, this is a lot of effort for not that many people. And so although I appreciate, right, always a more participatory opportunity and a more in-depth and meaningful experience, I'm also curious what, I am eager, right, when on the 20th to see the whole portfolio of efforts. So thank you so much. And that's just my one question at the time.
I can chime in here to start, and then certainly look to Brad and KJ to provide some additional thoughts, Taisha or Councilmember Adams. We haven't quite figured out what the consultant needs are going to be on this project yet. We are continuing to develop the scope and the expected
I'm sorry, I
deliverables.
misunderstood then. I heard
No,
that you had identified a consultant for this work. And I was like, oh.
Not quite. We're not quite there yet, but we will have additional information on what we anticipate some of those consultant needs to be here when we're back with you guys here on August 22nd.
Okay. Awesome.
And you'll also receive some additional information at that point as well on the community assembly and the makeup of that group. But I do just want to remind council that this is one of the methods that we intend to deploy. It's a very broad outreach process that we will go through, and we will utilize many methods that we have at our disposal to ensure that we are going out and reflecting the voices of everybody in our community. And I'll also just point out here as well that we do recognize that there has been historically underrepresented members of our community in planning processes such as this. And a major focus of this update will be to ensure that we do bring those historically underrepresented members of our community to the table, and that we can't necessarily expect them to come to us, right? And so we'll be looking for ways for us to go to them. And we are already working on several approaches that we will bring forward to you here in August. But I will also say that I think we are much better situated as an organization now than we ever have been to tackle some of these important issues. We have a lot of tools at our disposal that we didn't have at the last major update to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, including the racial equity instrument. The equity wasn't even a term in our sustainability, equity, and resilience framework at that point, and now it is. And so the racial equity instrument in and of itself will be utilized at really every phase within this project. And then we also do have a really robust network of community connectors that we absolutely intend to utilize in helping us to connect with some of those historically underrepresented members of our community.
Right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that and eager to find out more when that information becomes available. The other question I had, and it was about just more so the overview. And again, I'm wondering, what were the treaties that were broken, right, around our indigenous, and I'm hopeful when we have the update with the planning board and we're providing that more in-depth history, we're more explicit and reminding everybody not just about those historical wrongs that we still have to atone for, which is a part of our racial healing framework, but also, so please, I appreciate the equity tool, but if we don't have accountability frameworks and healing frameworks around those, then that's a tool that was always going to be insufficient by itself to do that work. But I am curious and I'm hopeful that we're able to be more explicit. And so that my question is, what are the treaties that were broken, that established these lands in 1851? And what are any other planning decisions that were made that were exclusionary and resulted in the disproportionalities that we see now? As a cautionary tale, history repeats itself because we don't know it. So my question is, can we tell the fuller story of our planning, the things that we did well, the blue line, la la la, and all the things you just shared, as well as the thing, and be more explicit around that? So that is both a question and a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, again, thank you for the question and the comment, Councilmember Adams. Our staff is continuing to understand this. We're beginning work here shortly on our existing conditions, and we anticipate that understanding that story will be a part of that work. And so I think as we come back to you all here in August, hopefully we can share a little bit more about our understanding of that. And it will be something that I think we continue to work on and continue to understand ourselves. And that will continue throughout the entire update process. But we can certainly come back with some additional information if it would help for you all to understand some of those key moments in our history as well here a little bit later in August.
And then my last question is how we're engaging and I look forward to, I didn't hear anything on the planning about whether Indigenous communities have ever been engaged in any way meaningfully. And of course, we have our tribal consultation. So that's not a part of this question, but more so the Indigenous component and the ways that, if at all, they were engaged in previous planning. Yeah, I just didn't hear anything about that, and I didn't read anything about it.
Yeah, and again, I think that's one of those more underrepresented members of our community that have traditionally been excluded from some of our planning processes. And so we'll be looking for ways to engage these communities. And I think when we come back here in August, again, we can provide a little bit additional information on how we intend to target those groups specifically.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. You got Mark, then Tina, then Lauren, then Ryan.
Yeah, I only have one question, and bear with me, it's a little far afield than but I'm doing this without agenda. I'm just curious. What's the relative size of Area 2 versus Area 3? Do we have any sense of that?
I'm not sure that I have the answer to that question. I don't know if anybody else on the call may. We may be able to do some quick analysis on that to get you an answer this evening, Mark, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the differential is between the two.
You can follow up with me, and my next question is it easier to annex Area 2 than Area 3? I guess I know we're moving forward on the planning reserve, but when I saw the large parcels of Area 2 that were available to us, it just struck me, is there a reason we're not kind of addressing those first? Is Area 3 easier to do, or would Area 2 be easier to do? Because there's a lot of Area 2 sitting out there.
There is, and that's
I'm happy to jump in on that
KJ,
one,
please.
just a little bit, just because of the connection, I think, with the planning reserve. So, to clarify, so area 2 are locations within the Boulder Valley that have already been identified as being eligible for annexation. So they are certainly much easier, just from a procedural standpoint of, an annexation application could come in, an agreement can be developed, and those areas could be annexed into the city. One thing I will mention that potentially complicates that a little bit is that there are a lot of existing properties that are within area 2 generally, whereas the planning reserve is primarily open land. So there's not a lot of development there, and area 2 has some nuance in terms of some of those locations actually may already receive either water or sewer service from the city. So there's a few complications there, but just from a sort of basic framework, area 2 is eligible to be annexed tomorrow, whereas the planning reserve still requires a sequence of events and a number of steps before that would ultimately become eligible and change to area 2 so it could be eligible for annexation.
Okay, and you can come back to me later with information on the relative sizes. It just looked to me like, the question that triggered in me is, are we ignoring low-hanging fruit in order to do something that's going to be much more complicated and difficult? And as I said, I have no agenda on it. I'm just curious. So
No.
the information you can provide me will be gratefully received. And that's my only question.
Very good. We got Tina, then Lauren, then Ryan, then Nicole.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing the historic context of the planning process. And I have a few questions. The first question I have is, do the other municipalities in the Boulder County have the same relationship with the county when they're doing their comprehensive plans, and that they're part of the approval and development process?
I think I'll
Did
look
that make
to KJ. There's something called a super IGA, but I will look to KJ to provide a little bit of additional context around that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yes, there's a very, very long titled intergovernmental agreement, which I'm not going to remember. So it's also known as the Super IGA, which is essentially was a intergovernmental agreement between the county and all of the different municipalities within. And generally, it serves the same purpose in terms of an agreement between the parties to observe and follow what has been established in their own individual municipal comprehensive plans, and also the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan, which covers all the unincorporated lands across the entire county. I do not think, at least that I am not aware of a similar situation within Boulder County between the other municipalities where there is actually a jointly adopted plan where the adoption and the approval of that plan goes through the 4-body review. I believe Boulder is unique in that term.
Yeah, and
so
I can chime in. We're definitely unique. There's not another city that has that same setup. Sorry, go ahead, Tina.
Okay, so that's something we chose to do, not that was mandated by the state.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. And then my other question is, it says that each area has to have a comprehensive plan with the population over 2,000. Is that plan, or who collects that plan at the state level and reviews it?
I don't believe there's any state mandated review of those. It is certainly a requirement, I believe, if you are applying for certain types of funding, related to certain topics. They would essentially check to make sure that there is a relevant element that's described included in that town's comprehensive plan. But I don't believe there's a clearinghouse, or there's certainly not a requirement that I'm aware of that we would need to submit that information to the state, for compliance of anything.
And then on a related topic, given the new housing intensity from the land use bill and the identification of the housing opportunity growth area, I could imagine that there might be some land use implications as well as zoning implications. Would this be the time and the vehicle that we would begin that conversation and that identification?
Yes, I do think that part of the conversation that we will have during the update process will be to consider and reflect upon those changes that occurred at the legislature this year. Also, there is now a requirement. There was a separate legislative bill that was adopted in this last session that requires us now to consider the regional housing needs assessment. So some of the work that Dr. Cog is doing around that, and some of the work that we're involved in with our surrounding towns in Boulder County, those kinds of information will now need to be considered and incorporated into the comprehensive plan.
Okay, and then another, and I mentioned this on my one-on-one with Nuria, is in addition to the great draft demographic information that Mayor Pro Tem Spear provided on her hotline, I also appreciated the demographic presentation given by the CU Regents from their demographer, which was more Boulder specific and also looked at the really unique population trends of students versus non-students in Boulder. I'm wondering if we could have a similar type of grounding so that we can look at that as well as trying to do an overlay with some pretty good data that the school district has on housing yield for students. Also by geography within the city, they have pretty good demographics on all of that. Is that a possibility or something we're considering with both the district and the regions?
I'll certainly defer to staff to answer that, but I'll anticipate that we have been thinking about that. We have been thinking about partnering with a demographer and others on this. And KJ or Brad, if you want to talk about more about those, but we definitely know that demographic and stats are critical to this plan. And I think that's an excellent addition, but don't know if the team has anything more to add on that.
Yeah, I'll just add that we certainly are thinking about that, and part of the existing conditions research that was mentioned that we're just beginning to embark upon will include a lot of that trends analysis, both the sort of economic and market trends of the city, but also our demographic trends, and certainly we anticipate hosting a study session with council as that information is starting to be gathered, and I could absolutely see an opportunity to invite in a special guest or two, if that would be possible, to present that information to all of you, and so everybody has a good foundation of information before we really get into questions around vision and policy.
Okay, and then my final question, so apologies for taking up so much time. Is there an opportunity in this process to take the key indicators and sort of outcomes that were created in 2015 and look at them at how successful the plan was in getting us closer to those outcomes so that we can sort of think about moving forward, where have we been working effectively, where not, or what are unrealistic outcomes or visions based on sort of where we are today?
That's a great question. Yes, absolutely. I think that you will see that as part of our existing conditions. As we bring that forward, we will be taking a look at some of the successes of the previous comprehensive plan and some of where we fell short in the previous comprehensive plan. So as we bring that existing conditions forward, I think that's something that you will see.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. This was incredibly helpful for me.
Great. We've got Lauren, Ryan, Nicole, Matt, and Taisha again.
Thank you. One of my first questions, so we have a 4-body review. And we're supposed to be in line with the Boulder County's comprehensive plan. Do we get any say in their comprehensive plan?
We do not, but it's partly because it only refers to and governs the unincorporated lands in the county that are outside the Boulder Valley. So as part of the 4-body review and as part of this relationship with city and county, as we develop the Boulder Valley comprehensive plan, we influence the decision making and the policies around incorporated lands, and vice versa. They provide input and comments to policies related to the city, because there's that interrelation between the two, particularly around the edges. And just to note as well, the 4-body review and the collaboration between city and county is as part of the update itself and the adoption of the new plan. And then if there are development review projects that come forward that are in area 2 or in the unincorporated areas, but within the valley, we share, and there's an opportunity for both, staff from both sides to be able to provide input. But certainly, any decision making in the future that's related just to the city only comes through planning board and city council. There's not a county component to those decisions.
Yeah, thank you. I remember the 2015 BVCP process took I mean, first of all, it took longer than we intended it to take, right? It stretched on for many years. And I guess I'm sort of, I don't know if there was an analysis done on how much staff time and cost that was, and how we're planning to maybe keep this process more in line. I know that we have staff for this project and that it's not above and beyond sort of our anticipated what we need to do as a city, but I also still want to be sensitive to the fact that we do have a lot of a variety of staffing needs. And so making sure that we are while going deeply into a lot of these really important things, are also still trying to find ways to make this process efficient.
Councilmember, I can speak to that. I appreciate kind of the sensitivity about realistic amounts of resources, staff resources, time, etc. Chris Ringos can probably speak to this a bit in specifics if useful, but I understand from the last update there were like 100 pop-up kind of meetings, and I think what maybe just speculating on that a little bit was an effort to try to do an outreach that was really meaningful by just doing more. And we've kind of stepped back and said, how do we do good, meaningful engagement, but not just quantity, but quality. And that's not a criticism of the past. I've certainly been subject to that throughout my career too, but I think there is a balance to be held. We'll present that full Gantt chart as part of the August presentation, but I think you'll see that we've worked real hard to find a balance between those touch points and the amount of resources that it takes. We want to make sure we're walking and chewing gum, right? We've got other planning things that staff needs to be working on, so we're going to be careful about that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I was wondering if you, and maybe it's as simple as just saying we'll find out more about this later, but what can we expect from the existing conditions analysis, or is that something you'll be giving us more information on in our future meeting?
The short answer is that's information to come still. We're very early on in that process of really developing what that existing conditions look like. So again, we can provide some more information and in-depth conversation around what we anticipate that to look like here in August.
I'd like to put a little plug for, I've seen some analysis around sort of looking at costs and revenue on lot based across the city, so that you get kind of also an idea of where infrastructure is really expensive to provide versus, where we're not seeing as much cost in terms of where we get more revenue within the city. And I think that would be an interesting piece of information to have as we move forward with this. One of the things I noticed is that our BVCP land use map pretty closely matches our zoning map. It's basically equally granular. And in your presentation, it sort of talked about how the land use is intended to be at a higher level. And so I'm wondering if what we see in Boulder currently with our Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan is considered a best practice, and how we might move towards potentially aligning with best practices.
Councilmember, I'm happy to speak to that. You've somewhat buried, or you somewhat disclosed the lead actually of what we're going to probably be previewing with you in August. We have at the staff level through a couple of happy coincidences, I would characterize, come to a similar question of whether the fine-grained nature of the comprehensive plan, which certainly has had its purpose over the years and evolved over the years, it's maybe time to kind of blow that back into a little bit more of a macro and more the chocolate cake, as Chris spoke to it. So that may be one of the big ideas we preliminarily propose with council.
I think that would be really exciting. So thank you. That's it for my questions.
All right, it was a good question, Lauren. Brad, I'm very intrigued with where you're going to go with that recommendation. I'll be waiting with bated breath for the August meeting. We've got Ryan, Nicole, Matt, and Taisha.
Thank you, Tess, Brad, KJ, and team. I have a few questions. First, can you talk a little more about how the sequence of negotiations and approvals will work in the context of a four-body process? So I can understand our body coming to agreement on something. Can you just say more about how we work with the other bodies and ultimately get to the end?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be fair, I have not actually gone through this process with the four bodies before. And so we're going to be learning from folks like Chris Meschuk and others that have been around through these kinds of processes and sort of lessons learned of how we've done that in the past. Certainly one of the things that I think we will explore is the opportunity for any kind of joint meetings that could either be between city council and planning board, or even city elected officials and county commissioners or county planning commission, so that we can have joint conversations around these policies and attempt to reconcile any major differences kind of through those mechanisms before we get too far down the road. We certainly want to avoid a sequence of back and forth, between one body and the other, because ultimately all four will need to approve the same document. One other thing I'll just mention that I think we are working towards, and again, we will share in more detail in a couple of weeks, is just what we are anticipating, trying to set expectations for what the final adoption will be in terms of content. So really, we are moving towards and thinking about the adoption of all of the narrative text and any accompanying graphics that are really required as part of that adoption. But the actual final sort of packaging and communication of this information, either as a booklet or a website, or ultimately whatever the format it is, will likely happen after the adoption process itself. So that would really just be the packaging of the information that we would do later. And that's partly in response to Councilmember Folkert's comments of trying not to let this process extend on for a really long time.
If I can jump in and add a little bit too, Councilmember, every point in history, no doubt, is going to have kind of a different need for what that communication and collaboration between county and city are going to be. But I do want to invite Deputy City Manager Chris Meschuk to maybe speak to what history has shown, recognizing that there are going to be many ways to go about it.
Appreciate that, Brad. Good evening, council. And Ryan, it's a great question. And as Brad just described, it changes a little bit with every update, but kind of mechanically, there are times where the city and county staff will essentially give updates or presentations to each of the four bodies in their respective meetings. And then there's typically other times where council and the planning board may have some joint meetings where you're getting updates, or you might hold joint public hearings and then go deliberate on your own. And then there are times where the council and the county, and the county board of county commissioners will hold joint meetings where you're talking kind of high level direction as well. And then the county will do the same thing. They'll hold joint sessions with their planning commission as well. So mechanically, it kind of happens in several different ways. The final decision making is, as KJ described, there'll be essentially a Word document of the final version of the plan or the draft maps that will come forward. And typically we hold those as a joint public hearing with the city, and then the county holds a joint public hearing, and then you each deliberate separately in your four bodies. And then if there is anything that's different, there's a little bit of back and forth that usually does happen. The city always goes first and the county goes second, typically, because the majority of the plan applies to inside the city limits. So does that, Ryan, help answer your question a little bit?
You kind of preambled it. I mean, I'm really thinking about an example where, say, our city council, the majority wants to do something, a reform on parking. Maybe we want to eliminate parking minimums. I don't know. Just as an example, we want to do a major reform. The county doesn't want to do it. then what?
I would forecast that likely is probably a city policy. So it would be a policy written that says the city will, revise parking minimums. City policies are only changed and approved by the planning board and the city council. So the county wouldn't have a say in a policy such as parking inside the city. So city only policies, only the city changes. Land use map changes inside the city are only done by the city. The only things that the county votes on are policies that are joint city county policies, or land use map, or area 1, 2, 3 map changes that are outside area 1 or inside the city limits.
Okay, but thank you for that. So following that example, maybe flipping it, if the county wanted to do something that was more stringent or whatever, new versus what the city is comfortable with, that would apply to just the county part of the BVCP and not the city part?
Correct. If there's a policy that is just specific to the rural preservation area of the comprehensive plan, then it would be a county only policy. There aren't a ton of those, but there are a few, if I remember right.
Sorry, go ahead.
And then is part of what you're asking just a little bit of what happens if the city and the county don't agree? How does that play out?
I heard you answer half of that. I heard you answer if the city wants to do something that the county doesn't want to do, the city is welcome to do it within our jurisdiction. So I think the second half of that is if the county wants to do something that the city doesn't want to do, does the county have jurisdiction over just the whole county inclusive of the city, or is it the areas outside of the city? Maybe this is a little abstract ask on its own, but I do think we're going to come up into pretty serious policy discussions.
Sure. Yeah, if it's an item that is really just applying to the unincorporated county of the Boulder Valley, then but there typically aren't a lot of those. But if there is an area of the plan, and we've had this happen in the past where the city and the county don't agree on the initial round of votes, then there typically is some back and forth that happens. There are even times where then the city council and the county commissioners get together and have a bit of a joint meeting where you talk about those policy issues and try and understand, is there some equal middle ground on that as well. I'm trying to think of a specific example off the top of my head, and one's not popping up, but Aaron may remember one off the top of his head. Maybe Gun Barrel Community Center plan that one's a little dated, but.
Okay. Well, we disagreed over whether to change the planning reserve adoption from 4 bodies to 3 bodies.
Yes.
We had a bit of a standoff on that for a few months and then agreed to stick with the 4 bodies.
That's actually a great example, and where then we finally came to an agreement, and actually, that's a great example of there were some changes proposed to the planning reserve in 2010 that didn't make it through the process. And then in 2015, we were able to revise it jointly with the county and got to ultimately an agreement. So happy to kind of share more examples in the future if that's helpful.
Thanks, Chris. I can tell that there's a little bit of art to this. So I'll leave it to that for now. Thank you. But maybe one thing just to finally explore some perimeters. Just as a thought experiment, if we just didn't agree at all on the plan and it was hard, maybe that's not the right example, but if we didn't come together, just theoretically, does the current BVCP sunset, or does it continue until we replace it with something else? Or another option?
Yeah, so the plan itself has a 25-year time horizon. Or 20-year time horizon. And then accompanying the plan is an intergovernmental agreement, an IGA between the city and the county. And that IGA has an expiration date on it. And then we have renewed that typically. There was a big conversation about renewal in the 2015 update, and it was ultimately that IGA was renewed. So there's kind of this commitment between the city and the county to do cooperative planning. And that does have an expiration date of that IGA. And as a part of each update, we typically then, as we do that update, we'll extend it for another 5 years.
When is it sunset, that IGA? When does it end?
Ooh, great question. Off the top of my head, I don't remember, but I bet we can get that for you.
Okay, fine. Thank you. My final question, then I'll stop. Shifting gears, I'm very interested in how we will ultimately give weight to different bodies, and if there's a hierarchy of weights that different bodies get and who the bodies are. For example, beyond the four bodies in the process, I think of a few institutions in the Valley as extremely important. One of those is BVSD. It's not the only one, but one of those is BVSD. There are other organizations I think are important, but I would really say, look, BVSD is in a class of it isn't a high class of the weight that we need to give. And so I'm just curious, are we going to have a discussion, are we intending, or could we have a discussion with council about this question of what are the weights that how we're thinking about giving different weights to different bodies, and if there are bodies that are, you know, especially important, is that a natural thing that we can and will do together?
Yeah, council member, I'm happy to kind of speak to that. I think you're also speaking to some other art of the process, which is really identifying key community partners. We've got a long working list already, and it will be very important to engage with those who contribute in specific ways in the community, and certainly BVSD is one of those.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, so I kind of heard an answer, but I guess my question will still maybe hang, and we can come back to it later, which is with respect to the weight that we are giving the opinions and you know, desires for these different organizations.
Sure. Yeah, maybe just one more turn of the crank on that. So when I speak to the art of it, you know, there's going to be a little bit of give and take. We know that there are natural groups that are community wide, a large representation or large impact on the community, and others that are smaller. And part of what we want to do is make sure that we're balancing that to hear the voices that may not be otherwise heard, but also recognize some of those entities, such as the school district, that do have citywide impacts. So yeah, we appreciate the question, and we will hope to define that more. And there's always opportunities to adjust as we go too, as we recognize a need.
Okay, thanks, Brad. I understand you're on the case. That's all. Thank you, Mayor.
Great. Now let's go to Nicole, Matt, Taisha, Tara.
Thank you. And this was, I think everybody's asked some great questions, and I feel like I've gotten most of my questions answered. So this was just more reflection on something that I think is working well tonight. You came to us with a broader timeline of when we're going to be having some of these next few discussions. So you told us, you know, tonight's training, ask your questions about, you know, the plan and how these things work and how they intersect with state and county and all that. And then you told us that next time we talk about this in August, we're going to be talking about engagement and community partnership and what that timeline and process will look like. And I think the more you can do that, since this is a work plan priority and we're trying to move through it faster than we might otherwise, the more it'll help us keep our discussions nice and focused and tight and give you the information that you are needing at each step. So just wanted to say thank you for doing that tonight and giving us that information. I at least found it really helpful, and just watching our discussion, it seems like others have too, but I appreciate that longer picture as we're doing the one-on-one meeting, work, and discussion. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. We got Matt, Taisha, Tara.
Thank you. I wanted to actually sort of dig a little deeper into Ryan's line of inquiry about BVSD. Beyond just being a partner, I'm just curious about how in previous comp planning processes, when we've maybe gone through a large bump in potential development. You know, obviously the planning reserve is kind of the key example, but looking back in the past ones, when have we kind of had a big new neighborhood go under redevelopment? Kind of in rapid succession. And then what did that do in terms of its linkage and impact with BVSD? Was it a, hey, we're about to develop a few thousand units, largely family housing. Hey, BVSD, you likely need a new school. Or like, what is the cadence there? Because I could see the conversation, certainly with the planning reserve, really having impacts if we're really going to do affordable housing in missing middle, necessitating perhaps whether it's a new school or a reinvigoration or remodeling, be it Crestview Elementary or Centennial Middle or others in the vicinity, like it seems like we would want BVSD to be a part of that so that they can do their financial planning to meet the needs of that housing that we are in that. So I just want to know if it's like, hey, we work hand in hand and we're good and we're tight on that, then that's all I need to know. But if there's some linkages that aren't normally there, I'd like to know that we can sort of close those gaps ahead of these big conversations.
Yeah, here again, I'd like to invite Chris Meschuk to maybe speak to that. And I will say we do have a close working relationship with the school district, and one that I want to really foster and build further, especially as it regards planning processes. But Chris, maybe you can add something to the past efforts.
Sure, happy to. And Matt, it's a great question. And BBSD typically has been pretty intimately involved in our comp plan updates. Like their planner is like part of our project team. It usually starts with, as we are doing the projections analysis and demographic analysis, we're working with them. They typically will provide some of their school data as well to help us understand the characteristics of neighborhoods. And then as land use map changes are being proposed, and some updates have little changes and some updates have lots of changes, but you know, if we rewind to think North Boulder, pre-North Boulder subcommunity plan, where it was very rural, that was a big part of the conversation was, you know, what does school enrollment look like in those various neighborhoods, that sort of thing. So depending on what the land use map changes look like, that would be a key part, is understanding what would that mean for enrollment based on their models of kind of population to children, and where they are in that arc of elementary, middle to high school. It's been a really great working relationship in the past.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. I know that we've inquired about a joint meeting between our legislative body and that of the school board, and maybe if this happens in a reasonable time, I know everyone's busy. Maybe this is a subject of conversation at a high level that we could instigate, so all of us elected officials could kind of get on the same page. Because it's more than just Area 3, right? There's the schools that are facing immense enrollment pressure on the western side of the school that may necessitate some rethinking about our land use in some form to maybe give them some extra love to shore up those schools. So anyway, I just all things in there, but it's great to see that there's a great close working relationship. That makes me feel pretty good about it, and just let us know how we can support those efforts.
I'll just add that they are very amenable to that. We have been working on trying to figure out scheduling. They've been super busy lately, but know that it is on the schedule agenda, and we are both really hopeful we can get that scheduled at some point soon.
Great, thanks. All right, folks, we got a few more hands. I'll just note we're nearing the end of our scheduled time for this item, but let's keep moving and get through the questions. We got Taisha, Tara, Lauren.
On that note, I'm in a double dip, so I'm going to defer to Tara and then I'll come back after.
Yeah, very generous of you. Thanks, Taisha. Tara.
Yes, I just want to say that I absolutely enjoyed this presentation, and I also got a lot out of my council colleagues' questions and comments. So Aaron, is it okay if I take pretty much less than a minute to second some of the comments instead of being
go ahead.
long with them? Okay. First, I want to agree with Mark on Area 2, low-hanging fruit. And I'm also curious about that because if I remember correctly, we had a recent annexation, which was the first time in who knows when, if ever, that we're able to get middle-income housing. I think that was South Boulder Road. So I'm also really interested in Area 2. Second thing is I agree with Lauren on the land use and zoning comment. Both do seem like recipes, not chocolate cake. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. Lauren, I didn't understand. I think I either got distracted for a change or didn't understand your revenue statement. If you want to explain it again, or maybe tell me at a different time since we're running out of time. Also, I appreciated two comments from Taisha. First of all, about the consultants. I agree with her that having local lately, and I'm not going to generalize, but there have been a few times where I've said, it would have been better if the consultants either were more local or understood the local situations a little bit better. And the other thing is I do a second on including our Native American community, without a doubt. Let me think if I have anything else. that is it. And again, I want to thank my council colleagues for really interesting questions and comments and a really great presentation.
Very good. All right, so back to Taisha and then Lauren.
Awesome. Thank you. I can't see myself, so hopefully you all see me somewhere in one of these boxes. So mine are two. One is to echo Tina's comments about accountability systems, not only with the county, but also with our other cities. I don't know if you actually use the term accountability systems, but I just felt like it's not just there's some kind of policy, but like that our plans speak to each other, that our timelines speak to each other. Those staff, I see them all working together anyway. But because we did not align at this level, they are always tripping over all of these limitations and bureaucratic barriers because we didn't align during the planning process. So I'm really excited and hopeful for those opportunities to align not only our values, but our accountability, our respective accountability frameworks, our timelines. I'm also hopeful in all of this. I didn't hear anything about monitoring and reporting and jointly. And so again, we struggle to get joint meetings and all of these things. And I'm just hopeful that, to me, this is the area where planning goes to die. No one thinks about how are we going to do the ongoing monitoring, ongoing reporting, and that kind of thing. So I'm hopeful in the process update that we get later in August that that'll be inclusive of our thoughts on how we're going to stay connected over the next 20 years. Thank you. Oh, yeah. And then two, sorry, was Lauren and the land use conversation about the county and our involvement there. And I just wanted to remind everyone that a lot of our ag land is in county property. And so pesticides don't know our county and city lines. And so it is absolutely critical, not that we necessarily have the authority to make a decision, but that we are in conversation just like we are now. And I think just in general, the climate is asking us to think very differently about how, and encouraging us to think very differently about how we're weaving and planning together. Because our wildlife doesn't know our little boundaries, our waterways, right, don't know our boundaries and don't respect them. And so I'm hopeful, again, that we can use this as an opportunity to model a more collaborative, intergovernmental, interdepartmental process that is more inclusive and participatory. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.
This whole conversation has sort of sparked for me thinking a little bit of, I get how we get to the relationship we have with the county through this process, but I sort of wonder if it might make sense to try and also have the school district or CU involved with this, because sort of similarly to our reasoning behind why we have the county involved, being that they have the ability to have substantial impact on the city. Those other, BVSD and even more so maybe CU equally has that ability. And it's interesting that I mean, maybe we have, and I'm just not aware of it, but I don't feel like we have the same kind of IGA or attempted relationship to provide kind of predictability or a framework around how we work together in a similar way there. And I could see that being something that might be interesting to both parties, but also could be very difficult. So just throwing it out there as a thought, but would be interested to hear maybe more as you guys come back in August, if you have thoughts on that.
Thanks for that, Lauren. I'll just chime in here and note that there is a quarterly leadership meeting between the city, the county, CU, and BVSD, and really appreciating everybody bringing up the importance of these relationships. And I'm sure that'll be an important topic for those quarterly meetings as we move through the comprehensive plan process to keep those partners engaged and involved. Okay, great questions, great comments, phenomenal presentation. I, for one, am getting very excited about the things to come and appreciate this kickoff happening in 2024 to keep us on schedule. So lots of good work to come. Staff, any final words before we move on from this item?
No, thank you. Or no, we don't. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for all the fantastic work, and I guess we'll see you in about a month.
Thanks.
All right, so with that, we'll move on to matters item 5B. Please, Elisha.
Yes, sir. Thank you. 5B is the Boulder Municipal Airport Community Conversation Financial Analysis.
Thanks so much, and I'll kick it off briefly, but appreciate that. Our next item has certainly been a topic of a lot of community conversation. And before I kick it over to staff, I just wanted to remind us of where we were a year ago. Frankly, to remind myself, I'll say I just recently went back and watched that meeting to make sure we were being responsive to that request back then. And I put all of that whenever I go back and watch a meeting under the category of time I will never get back, but time well spent. You'll hear more detail of some of that work that's been done and brought forth to you today. But I'll say that last August, when we met with you, staff had been thinking about the improvements that were needed at the airport, and we're cognizant at that time that leaning on federal grants could extend our contractual obligations with our partners at the FAA in ways we were uncertain of at the time, giving emerging conversations about the future use of the airport site. At the time, staff decided not to pursue any further grants as we engaged community in conversations and sought to get some more insight from council on where it was leading regarding the future land use of the airport site once, once what we understood to be our contractual obligations at the airport terminated. While there was a lot of rich discussion, including a desire by a few members to perhaps pursue additional community engagement or even pursue a housing study at the site, ultimately, council asked staff to bring back some very specific information. Additional information regarding the financial impact of potentially decommissioning the airport in the future. Additional information about the FAA's perspective about this conversation to determine whether repurposing the airport was even a viability. And some additional perspective about the potential and or impact for litigation in this matter beyond and perhaps given what we have heard from the FAA. While the last has been supplied to council confidentially, the memo and presentation before you today responds to the first two items requested. We want to recognize too that we're in a different place now than we were a year ago. We have new council members, we have new interest in community, especially as a ballot initiative has been gathering signatures, and there is now a certified petition coming before council soon. And the FAA has given us additional information that you'll also be hearing about throughout this presentation. As a result, we know that there are more questions, new information that has been requested, and a desire to have an even greater level of financial detail beyond simply the potential for decommissioning, such as the cost of potential land remediation if used differently, and potential infrastructure costs depending on the type of use the site could potentially be envisioned for. We've appreciated your questions as they show just how complex this matter is, and we hope to get some of those additional questions, at least at a high level, answered through the presentation, knowing that at the moment, some of these additional costs are truly hard to ascertain given the many variables that are at play. With that, I'll turn it over to Allison to kick the presentation off and thank all of Transportation and Mobility, the City Attorney's Office, and the finance staff who've worked really hard throughout this entire process to not only engage with community, but to delve into the many intricacies of technical and financial nuance that is frankly really hard to fully lay out in a memo form without more questions popping up, and we have certainly seen that. So with that, Allison, perhaps I'll send that over to you.
But before you do that, and thanks for all that, Nuria, if I could call on Lauren, please, who I think has something relevant to share with us.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure it was on the record that I will be recusing myself from this item. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. We'll see you later. Allison, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, Council. Thank you for having us this evening to share an update on the Boulder Airport. As Nuria mentioned, I'm Allison Moore-Farrell, Senior Transportation Planner with the city. As you may recall, I led the Community Conversation Project last year and was last here presenting the initial draft scenarios with you in August 2023. Sorry, I skipped ahead once. Apologies. I have the pleasure of presenting the information tonight alongside my colleagues John Kinney and Karen Steiner. We'll also be joined here this evening by members of the project team from Aeroplex and Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to update City Council on the additional information that was requested at your August 2023 meeting when we presented the initial findings from the community conversation process. We'll provide a brief overview of that project process for everyone to get their bearings, and then dive into the technical analysis that you requested to help inform next steps. As you may recall, language from the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan drove the need for the community conversation that began in late 2022. In 2015, this language was incorporated into the Boulder Valley Comp Plan to commit the community to reassess the potential for other community-serving uses, such as housing on the airport site, at the time of the next airport master plan. As shared, this process stemmed from recommendations in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, increased tensions between the airport user community and the broader Boulder community, the need to improve airport facilities, and preparation for a potential future master plan update. The city conducted conversations with stakeholders and developed 4 community-informed potential long-term scenarios for the future of the airport site. This engagement process and resulting high-level scenario comparison was intended to provide a better understanding of the community's desired future of the airport site for city leadership and city council. We held 2 widely attended open houses, developed and led a community working group with a wide range of stakeholders who are impacted by the airport, held bilingual community meetings at mobile home communities that are adjacent to the airport, hosted 2 online questionnaires, and conducted in-depth interviews with community members. We aim to share information about the airport, gather lived experiences and ideas among community members, and share input that had been received. From these efforts, we learned about key issues and outcomes that neighbors, tenants, pilots, and community members have. This helped provide baseline information and shape future engagement needs and helped identify some information gaps. We learned that there was a lack of general knowledge around the Boulder Municipal Airport. We learned that folks were interested and/or concerned about noise, leaded fuel, rules and regulation, economic impact, environmental impact, and community relations. The community working group and bilingual community meetings were especially effective as we reached a deeper level of engagement and collaboration with those groups. As we moved further through the process and developed long-term scenarios from community member ideas, as well as short-term action items, we learned what folks liked and disliked about each scenario that was developed, what opportunities and constraints they identified, and areas where they would like more information. This information was shared with City Council in August 2023 and February 2024, and we're happy to answer any additional questions regarding that engagement. When staff shared the outcomes of the community conversation with City Council in August 2023, City Council requested 3 items to better understand the potential ramifications of decisions involving the potential repurposing of this site. First, additional legal analysis, which is ongoing and that we won't be discussing this evening. Second, Council requested to better understand the FAA's position regarding the future use of the airport site. To that end, in January 2024, NURIA sent a letter to the FAA asking for their response to 3 questions related to our obligations. The FAA issued a response in March 2024, and in it they were clear in their response that our federal obligations remain in effect in perpetuity and that it is highly unlikely they would support closure. Additionally, in conversation between city and FAA staff, the FAA has asserted that if the city continues to explore a path to closure, the FAA will exact fines if they find us in non-compliance of our current assurances. Now, we'll move into the main portion of the presentation this evening regarding the requested financial analysis. And I will hand it over to John to introduce the CIP development for each financial scenario.
Allison, thank you. Good evening, Mayor Brockett, members of the City Council. My name is John Kinney, Airport Manager here in Boulder, Colorado. I'll now share a bit about the 2 financial scenarios and assumptions for each capital plan. Before I define the 2 scenarios, it's important to note that Boulder Airport is unique, and the unique qualities of our airport also limit our ability for revenue generation. So as we begin this work to gather additional information regarding the cost to continue to operate the airport without grants, staff determined key drivers for revenue considerations. First, Boulder is primarily a recreational facility. Aviation fuel sales are low in comparison to surrounding airports, further restricting revenue generation potential and exacerbated by the permanent facility constraints. We do not have a precision GPS approach, making Boulder Airport really a blue skies airport or a fair weather facility, which diminishes the likelihood of operations during unpredictable weather. Additionally, the runway is too short to accommodate jets or larger aircraft on a regular basis, and even then, only medium to small size aircraft. Additionally, facility constraints, such as existing ramp geometry, discourage larger aircraft. Small aircraft parking is already constrained, and so we would need to make changes for jets over our existing core tenant base. We would not pursue that. Therefore, jet traffic under either scenario would likely not noticeably increase. Boulder Airport development footprint is relatively small, approximately 20 acres, and that is the scope of the ability to generate additional revenues to cover our capital project needs. Due to decades of deferred maintenance, capital pavement needs are financially have become burdensome, requiring the city to utilize the limited revenue generating strategies available. Now I'll describe, excuse me, the two financial scenarios. While these two financial scenarios contain some elements of the four community-informed scenarios from the earlier community conversation process, the two final scenarios we are presenting tonight are distinct from that process and responsive to the City Council's specific request from the August 23rd meeting. We recognize the assumptions were made in both financial scenarios, and there can be variations within these. Recognizing this, it's important to understand that the general deferring direction of the two scenarios would remain. Financial scenario one would continue to use the existing site primarily for aviation use for the foreseeable future and assume the resumption of pursuing and accepting FAA grants. Scenario one's capital improvement plan is an approximate projection of the capital improvements that were identified in the most recent airport master plan and reflect optimum scope and timing for the 18-year planning horizon. The costs are associated with maintaining existing facilities as well as investing in development of the Boulder Airport. While you'll see the costs are high in the 18-year period, costs for this scenario could likely be balanced through prioritization and timing of capital projects, as well as securing additional FAA state discretionary grants. Excuse me. Financial scenario two assumes the existing site will be repurposed in the future, thereby continuing to operate and maintain Boulder Airport without grants until lawful closure is feasible. Scenario two is an estimate of the capital improvement costs associated with maintaining existing facilities for FAA grant obligations. Capital projects would focus primarily on the priorities, affordability, and developing Boulder Airport with limited term leases. The last grant received by the FAA was in 2021. Given the 20-year obligation to maintain and operate the airport from the last grant received, 2041, which is 18 years in the future, would be used as the feasible closure year. Although this continues to be contested by the FAA as highlighted in the beginning of the presentation. Switching gears to the assumptions applicable to both scenarios. To conduct the financial analysis and better understand how much more it would cost the city to continue operating the airport without grants, staff developed assumptions for each scenario. It goes without saying that under both scenarios, the city would remain compliant with FAA grant obligations. As for revenue strategy assumptions under each scenario, we assume updating rents and charges, including fees like landing fees for the recovery of costs for provided service levels, new leases for existing and future tenants, with options for long-term leases in exchange for incurring ongoing operating, maintenance, and capital costs. These new lease terms would remove operating and maintenance costs from the airport's annual budget. And finally, new hangar developments as well as new aeronautical developments under both scenarios. It is important to note that the city would not invest in development of these parcels under either scenario. It's also important to highlight here that allowing new developments on existing vacant airport land is not only a revenue strategy, but is also required for our FAA grant obligations and consistent with the most recent airport master plan adopted in 2007, which includes an airport development plan. And while development is required per the FAA, it is also scalable through future refinements to the master plan. This assumption identifies public-private partnership as a way to achieve long-term development, which removes upfront capital and long-term O&M costs from the city financial obligations. While hangar development is needed under either scenario to achieve the financial sustainability and to be consistent with the 2007 Airport Master Plan, hangar developments does not necessarily mean more jets or proportionate increase in traffic. Examples of commercial hangar development include, but is not limited to, specialty services such as aircraft maintenance, aircraft manufacturing, interior modification services, paint or upholstery shops, as well as aircraft storage or aviation in support of scientific research, and the list continues. In addition to the assumptions applicable to both scenarios, Scenario 1 and 2 also have unique assumptions. As I said, under Scenario 1, the city would keep the airport open for the foreseeable future, which would allow the CIP to be implemented over time with more flexibility than Scenario 2. This is an important note that we can come back to, and Karen, our next speaker, will further explain in the financial analysis section for the council. The city would apply for and accept federal and state grants as deemed necessary under Scenario 1, which would provide more financial flexibility. All available undeveloped airport property would continue to be made available to third-party interest for hangar development, thereby increasing leasable land and airport revenues from today. And airport facilities would be maintained at a higher degree of permanency given the expectation that the airport would remain open. Now for Scenario 2. As I said, the city would pursue a course of action to lawfully close Boulder Airport in 2041, the date staff estimates the city obligations would be fulfilled. And in doing so, the city would continue to not pursue or accept any additional federal or state grants. Some undeveloped airport property would be made available to third-party interest for hangar developments, thereby increasing the total leasable land and airport revenues from today, but less than in Scenario 1. To attract development for the short 18-year duration remaining for Boulder Airport, some level of lease relief would be identified to attract short-term development for a portion of the unamortized capital investment. These specific lease relief amounts have not been determined or fully analyzed. Moving on to the capital plan. The capital improvement plan for each scenario was developed as a high-level planning tool. For both scenarios, it takes into account the existing conditions of airport capital infrastructure and needs for capital maintenance based on the current state of repair. The capital improvement plan also estimates the capital cost for maintaining existing infrastructure and proposed future developments on undeveloped airport land. In Scenario 1, the capital improvement plan is consistent with the most recent 2007 Airport Master Plan. And in Scenario 2, it assumes a minimum yet responsive level of investment to meet our FAA grant obligations. The development potential, excuse me. As part of an orientation, if you look to the left of this map, you'll see a blue area that's Hayden Lake. That's to the west. The alignment of the map is, the top is north. At the top, running from left to right, is a highlighted shaded area. That is the main runway, runway 8. The clear silhouettes, rectangles, and squares that you see sprinkled amongst that area are existing buildings. Those areas that are highlighted in black and yellow dashed lines or purple squares, that is the actual currently vacant, undeveloped land at the airport that is available. So this map shows where the existing airport sites are located. There's undeveloped land and potential for development by third parties. You also see that it's numbered A through J. So that is also the estimation in which the market would respond in sequence as to what developments would go first. A and B would go first, and subsequently in sequence all the way through J. It is important to note that under neither scenario would the city invest in developing of these parcels. Again, future development of these parcels is an important revenue strategy for either scenario. This is where the P3 concept is critical, in that private development would take on the initial capital investment, ongoing O&M expenses in exchange for airport land lease, and in turn would lower our ongoing city fund expenditures. You'll see here shortly in the slides that Karen will walk you through that in scenario 1, the revenue potential is greater because parcels A through J have the potential for third-party investment. Whereas in scenario 2, only A through D have potential for third-party investment due to the constrained time horizon and potential for lawful closure. I will now hand it over to Karen to introduce herself as well as walk you through the financial analysis.
Good evening, City Council. As John said, I'm Karen Steiner, Senior Budget Analyst at the City. I will jump into the findings from the analysis. Given the conditions noted and the proposed capital improvement plans, the project team developed a financial analysis for each scenario, and on the following slides, I will present the high-level results. The financial analysis estimates the annual revenue and expenses each year over the 18-year time horizon and compares the 18-year totals in future dollars. This first slide shows the total revenues by type in future dollars for each scenario. Scenario 1 is shown in blue and scenario 2 is shown in yellow. In scenario 1, the model predicts higher lease and fee revenue because with the expectation that the airport will continue to operate, there will be more interest in long-term leases and development. Scenario 1 also assumes $8.7 million in grant revenue as the city would resume pursuing and accepting federal and state grants. As seen in the far right column, in total, the model predicts scenario 1 would result in $14.8 million more revenue over the time horizon than scenario 2. Next, we will look at the 18-year expense comparison for each scenario. The total anticipated existing and new expenses are identified on this slide, again in future dollars. The first set of bars on the left of this slide show the model assumes operating expenses are the same under both scenarios. The second set of bars show the city's share of the total CIP expense under both scenarios. As John noted, the difference in the capital improvement plans under the two scenarios is the key difference. Scenario 1 is at $30.1 million and scenario 2 at $13.2 million for the capital improvement plans. In scenario 1, the CIP is consistent with the most recent 2007 airport master plan. And in scenario 2, it assumes a minimum responsive level of investment to meet grant obligations. CIP costs are approximately $17 million higher in scenario 1 than in scenario 2. Next, we'll look at the full scope of the proposed CIP and how that relates to the proposed public-private partnerships. This table shows the full proposed CIP under each scenario and the assumed party responsible for funding. It also shows the use of funds and the estimated costs, assuming 100% P3 or 100% public-private partnership. These amounts are shown in 2024 dollars. 100% P3 in the model means we are maximizing private investment in hangar aprons, hangar maintenance, and development of new hangars. The first row on this chart is the public or the city's portion of the P3 partnership. It's to maintain the airside and landside pavements and facilities. The 19.5 million you see in scenario 1 on this slide for airside, landside pavements and facilities, when adjusted for inflation, equals the 30.1 million CIP expenses in future dollars shown on the previous slide. This again shows greater investment by the city in scenario 1, where the CIP is consistent with the most recent 2007 airport master plan, and scenario 2 is the investment level to meet our current grant obligations. The next portion of the graph is where we see the private portion of the P3. First, in exchange for longer-term leases, the maintenance for hangar aprons, hangar buildings would shift from the city to the leasee, and that total amount for those two line items is 12.8 million. The next line is the development, and it is assumed developers would be responsible for the new hangar development. This shows greater investment by private developers in new hangars under scenario 1, with the expectation that the airport would remain open indefinitely. Next, we will focus on why the public-private partnership is critical. This chart shows the total city funded amounts for each scenario with varying degrees of participation in the public-private partnership, 100%, 50%, and 0%. One note, the financial analysis from Aeroplex assumes 100% P3. The city funding amounts at 100% for each scenario shown here correlate with the cost to the city over 18 years as described in the Aeroplex narrative. Under scenario 1 at 100% P3, the potential city funding is 11.8 million. In scenario 1, the city would resume pursuing state and federal grants, and the city could achieve affordability through discretionary grants and prioritizing and elongating timelines in the proposed CIP, thus the use of potential in the title. In scenario 2, the required city funding is 9.9 million. In this scenario, the city is not accepting grants, so the full cost of the CIP to ensure a safe FAA compliant airport is the responsibility of the city. So what do we mean by a certain percentage of P3? The 100% P3 in scenario 1 means that in the model, we maximize private investment in hangar aprons, hangar maintenance, and the development of new hangars. Specifically, that 12.8 million that I pointed out on the table on the previous slide for hangar aprons and hangar maintenance would shift from the city to the leasee in both scenario 1 and scenario 2. In terms of hangar development for 100% P3 in scenario 1, on the map that John showed earlier, parcels A through J would be developed by private investors, and in scenario 2, parcels A through D would be developed by private investors. 50% P3 in scenario means that 6.4 million for hangar aprons and hangar maintenance, which is 50% of the full $12.8 million cost. That 6.4 million would shift from the city to the leasee. And in scenario 1, only parcels A, B, C, F, and G would be developed by private investors. Again, the shift of 6.4 million from the city to the leasee for the hangar aprons and hangar maintenance is the same in scenario 2 for 50% P3. And in scenario 2, only parcels A, B, and C would be developed. The main driver for the difference we see in the city funding at 50% P3 is that while the ongoing maintenance costs are the same in both, the expanded development in scenario 1, there is higher new lease revenue to help offset the cost of that ongoing maintenance. At 0% P3, the city is funding the full cost of the $12.8 million for existing hangar aprons and hangar maintenance, and there is no additional revenue from new developments. These graphs purposefully show the importance of 100% P3. We do not propose 50% or 3% P3. We would be striving for as close to 100% P3 as the market allows. Again, it's important to note that in both scenarios, the new development would be market driven. This last graphic on the financial analysis is structured like the previous slide, but shows the average annual city cost over 18 years, whereas the previous slide had the total cost over 18 years. The amounts at 100% P3 correlate to the average annual amounts in the Aeroplex narrative, rounded for simplicity on this slide. The average annual potential city funding in scenario 1 ranges from $655,000 to $2.5 million. In scenario 1, we would resume pursuing state and federal grants and could achieve affordability through seeking discretionary grants and prioritizing and elongating timelines in the proposed CIP. In scenario 2, the annual average required city funding ranges from $551,000 to $2.3 million. This analysis attempts to address the financial impact of potentially decommissioning the airport. There are many outstanding questions that were outside the scope of this analysis that require further research. While the analysis identified the potential for significant revenue generation from proceeds of the land sale, we acknowledge that there are limitations to this analysis and more study is needed to fully understand the additional financial implications related to scenario 2, including refining the fair market value of the airport land, the cost to reimburse the FAA for land purchased with FAA grants, the cost of lease relief, and any additional costs for site remediation and urban services. To summarize, improvements and financial investments are needed in order to remain compliant with our FAA obligations while also reaching financial sustainability. In the meantime, regardless of which scenario is chosen, staff will continue to move forward with these key work plan items, and we will continue to operate the airport per our FAA obligations. We have started development on the primary management compliance documents and expect those to be published in Q1 2025. The remaining items here will move forward in the coming months. And with that, this slide shows the questions we have for City Council, but before we get to that, we just wanted to open it up for any clarifying questions on our presentation.
All right, thanks so much, everyone, for all that great information. So, Council, let's stick for now to clarifying questions strictly, and then we'll move into feedback for city staff. So, clarifying questions, please. I've got Mark, Tina, Nicole. Okay.
Yeah, a couple of questions. In the Aeroplex document, they assume there's a gap between revenues and expenses over the next 18 years without grants of about $9.9 million. Is that accurate?
So good evening, Council. I'm Natalie Stifler, the Director of Transportation and Mobility. I'm going to act as facilitator again, as I did with Iris, because we have a whole team of folks here. As Allison said, we've got the consultant team and our staff. So for that one, I will let Karen Steiner take that question. Thank you.
So yes, in the Aeroplex report, under scenario 2, the anticipated or what the modeling is showing for the expense to the city would be $9.9 million.
Okay, then how
In
do,
scenario 1 at 100%, sorry.
no, that's not what I thought that document said. I thought they were saying that there's a gap, even in scenario 2 of about 9.9. And going back to your earlier chart, you showed a set of revenues and a set of expenses for the 18-year period, and that didn't look anything like, that looked like $9.9 million also.
Right, it was 9.9 for scenario 2. I think Karen misspoke on that one.
Okay.
So Karen, do you want to jump in on the difference between the Aeroplex report and then what's shown in that 100% P3 versus 50 and 0 again, just to reiterate that?
Yeah, Allison, do you mind sharing the presentation again?
Sure, I'll pull that up just one moment.
And can we start on slide 28? So this is a slide we had prepared that just shows the calculation of how we got to the 11.8 million in scenario 1 and the 9.9 million in scenario 2. The first row shows our beginning fund balance that we started 2024 with of 1.7. That's the same in both scenarios. The 18-year projected revenues are the same as I showed on the revenue graph earlier, 40.4 for scenario 1 and 25.6 for scenario 2. And then the third line is the 18-year projected expenses. Again, the main driver for the difference there is the CIP. And so when you start with the fund balance, add the revenue minus the expense, that's where we're getting the 11.8 in scenario 1, 9.9 in scenario 2 in the Aeroplex report.
I'm not questioning that, but if this is the case, is not that a gap of about $500,000 or $600,000 a year, not 2.6?
So yeah, I will explain the nuance there. And if we can go back to slide 17, Allison, thank you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and find that. Just one moment.
So when we get to slide 17, we'll see the 11.8 and the 9.9, which tie to the Aeroplex report.
Mm-hmm.
Then from that assumption of 100% P3, we also wanted to look at, well, what would it look like if we only had 50%? And what would we look at it if we had 0%?
Okay, let me just ask one more clarifying question. Neither the Aeroplex report nor your tables indicate that $9.9 million gap is based on 100% P3. It's simply a difference between revenues and expenses. So it's subtraction. And the gap appears to be $9.9 million over 18 years. And I'm trying to understand why that's not the case, since it's
because the assumption, and others jump in here, but the assumption around the revenues to get to that 9.9 is that there is some development happening and some public-private partnership, or 100% public-private partnership for the developments. And so if you don't have that public-private partnership, we were trying to play out some scenarios of, if you don't have private investment for those developments to bring in that additional revenue and cover that upfront capital and ongoing O&M, then you get you know, in that worst case scenario, you're subsidizing the 2.6 million a year, or whatever the figure is. Best case, you're at 9.9 over 18 years. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I will tell you that it's entirely opaque. And requires a little bit of clarification.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, next we have Tina, Nicole, Tara, Matt.
Yeah, and thank you, Mark, for asking about that, because I had some similar questions, because some of the differences over 18 years aren't as large as it looked initially when I looked at it. The one question I had is, it was mentioned that the plan that's referred to as a master plan in 2007 requires development of the shaded purple areas. How much development has happened since 2007 until today?
John, can you take this one for us?
Yes, Tina, thank you for the question. There's been 2 hangars built in the airport since the last 2007 airport master plan. Although the graphical depiction shows, and it's a planning document, it's not a design document, but it shows primarily T hangars or individual hangars. Although we have a 7-year waiting list, none of those hangars have been built because of the economics. The 2 hangars that were built were small box hangars, and that's a relative term, right? But anywhere from about 60 to 60 by 60, 2 hangars built since that period of time.
And has there been a lot of interest in development in the area in the last, since 2007?
Well, I would use what developed as gauging actual interest. So you've had 2 box hangars built, and you probably had half a dozen or so individuals, maybe 6 to 8 individuals, stopping in the office for the last 2.5 years seeking to build some type of hangars. Um, but the economics are really diminishing that. So, did that answer your question? I'm sorry, Tina.
Yeah, so I guess it's the new kind of development envisioned. Is there different economics that makes that more appealing?
Well, I think there was some confusion or assumptions made that by some of the graphical depictions that we show in the Kimley Horn report, we were just trying to show areas of where you could build box hangars. Box hangars, you get the economies of scale. They are not to attract jets. You could build them like the last 2 that have been built out at this airport. Jets are not in those hangars. They could be in terms of the size, but that's not what Boulder attracts. We attract small recreational sport aviation, and that is the plan to go forward. So even though we have some of those depictions of big red box hangars, that's really representative of what the market is gone to for the economies of scale. You can build it and then put in multiple aircraft to recoup your capital investment. So that's some of the dynamics going on with those graphics.
And I may just add there, just to your question, Tina, around like, are the economics there or is the demand there? And I think as John referenced, there has been, we've heard interest. I think the conversation we've been having over the last couple of years also causes some just maybe hesitation from the development community. And so that certainly is, I think, at play at the moment. And John, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, I think you're right. I think it's also a combination of the unpredictableness in that people would need to recoup the capital investment over a long-term period of time. And we've been a little bit of a timeout as we've gone through this community public process that we find our discussions in tonight. So that's been part of the delay for the market to respond to demand.
I think that's a great segue to my next question is if we indicate that we're not going to accept grants and thereby indicating that we're looking to decommission the airport, it seems to me that there wouldn't be much interest and I wouldn't be very confident that the 100% P3 scenario was even attainable. Is that?
So, right. So one of the strategies that I think John spoke to in the presentation is that we would need to offer lease relief clause in any long-term contract. And that we did not do the further analysis to look at what that financial impact would be on the city to eventually be able to buy out the amortization of those leases at, the time at which we would want to lawfully close. So that would be some additional study that we would need to do to look at what that additional cost would be. But that would, we assume, be an attractive, option for people to develop if they know that their costs are going to be covered if we were to lawfully close at the end of that period.
Okay, I do think that's an important financial analysis in terms of thinking about what our revenue would be what kind of revenue we might generate if we're going to incur a different an additional cost upon exit. So I do have some concerns about that whole concept on an 18-year timeline for private capital development, but would defer to you as you look at that analysis further. And then my second question is just more of and it actually doesn't relate much, well, kind of relates to the financial analysis. We're part of a county and the airport is mentioned in our IGA with the county in section 6. And it just makes mention that, that we should be developing housing near the airport, which is kind of interesting, and or explore it. Do we talk to our partners or our neighbors in Longmont and in Rocky Mountain, even though it's Jeffco, but it impacts Superior and Rock Creek in particular? Are we speaking to our neighbors about how our potential closure would affect them? And do we have to communicate with the county about the airport at all, because it is mentioned in the IGA?
To my knowledge, we haven't started those conversations with our, partners and local airports adjacent to our community or with Boulder County. John, is there anything to add there? That's certainly something that we could engage in if that, is a desired next step.
Yeah, given the uncertainty of a decision, we have not had any of those discussions.
I will say, and I just want to add, because I've had brief discussions with some of our county parties and county partners. And I believe I can say that they have expressed some concerns about potential closure, and they are just waiting to see what conversations happen at this level. And I don't believe I can say much more than that, other than just to realize that they have the jail nearby in proximity, and that perhaps they had some language in the comp plan or plans regarding the airport site, but they've expressed some concerns.
Thanks. And then I'm going to respect Erin's request to stick with questions and not do comments, but I would like to make a comment afterward, if that's okay.
We'll get to it for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nicole, Tara, Matt, Taisha.
Thank you. I just have a few clarifying questions here. One, John, in the presentation, there was a slide that said there wouldn't be any new development, and then you're kind of talking about new development. And it makes me think that I'm not understanding the different ways that development's being used here. So I wonder if you could just kind of help me understand what that distinction is there.
John, do you mind if I jump in here? Because I think maybe this was actually confusion that I may have added. So we were trying to make clear that the city would not invest in new development. So no city dollars would be used for new development. We're looking for new development from the private sector in order to generate revenue. So I think if that is what you were, maybe what caused some confusion. Does that help, Nicole?
Yes, yeah, no, that does. So you're basically just saying no city investment in new development, but the plan is very clearly that there would be new development, just when we invested. Thank you. That does clarify it. And then my kind of part B of that question is just around the whether we have any data on how this kind of new development of hangars and things like that impacts on traffic and use. And I heard John say that not expected to really increase use. And since we've had a couple new hangars come in since 2007, do we have any data? Is there any data out there in kind of the universe of small recreational airports that can address this question definitively of what the relationship is between kind of building new things at an airport site that serve airport users and airport traffic?
John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, difficult question to answer and to quantify, because the very nature of a general aviation airport is everything is unscheduled. Whereas you go to other airports that have scheduled service, you can quantify it down to any aspect of that flight, rental cars, parking, anything. So it makes it difficult for general aviation type airports. The FAA complicates it a little bit in a sense to also answer that question, in that we're not allowed to discriminate or restrict any particular class user from accessing the airport. So, for example, if you brought in a flight school, you would have far more operations than if you brought in someone who was just a single aircraft owner, or maybe a maintenance shop. So, depending upon the activity, it would have a very different level of operational count, traffic count, to answer your question. So, some airports do create the character of their airport by encouraging specific types of users to come into the airport, because that's the market niche that they serve, whether it's because of the community or just what they want the airport to be in terms of fitting and complementary to the character of the community. So I'm not giving you a great answer other than to share with you that there's many variables in play, but we don't have the ability to say we will only accept these three operators who have fewer operations, but you can encourage it. What is a subtle nuance?
So basically, it sounds like depending on who the developers would be and what would go in there, that would have a really big impact on the traffic at the airport. And that's not really something we have direct control over, though we can certainly try to encourage certain folks. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then my kind of moving on to my second question. You mentioned a couple times that this is a primarily recreational facility, and it just, in my mind, I immediately go to our Parks and Rec department. And one of the ways that they have been dealing with kind of rising costs and things is to change how they're doing user fees. And I'm just wondering if this is a way to explore, like, rather than thinking about taking money from the general fund or something, since these are primarily recreational uses, can user fees be a way that we can generate more revenue rather than kind of going through this process of trying to encourage new folks to kind of come in? Can we expand fees or change the way that we do fee structures, kind of like Parks and Rec has had to do over the years?
Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. Yes, definitely user fees are an element in the recipe of how do we make the airport as affordable as possible. The reason we framed it up as it's a recreational airport, our volumes are very low. I mean, we have about 65,000 annual operations, and you go over to an airport just to the south of this Rocky Mountain, they have over 285,000 annual operations, 1,700 acres to develop. $900,000 in annual revenue just from the fuel sales alone. We have $7,500. You could quadruple our fuel volume, and it's still going to be just coins in the bucket to try to address the capital plan that we're required to implement, because we've deferred maintenance for so long. Now it's really the more expensive options remain to fix this pavement. So yes, you'd look at user fees of landing fees. You could raise rents through a renegotiation of existing leases. You could institute some additional fees, but given our volumes so low, it makes it really difficult. And unfortunately, the pavement out there is our number one expense in our capital plan, is usually the case for airports. And it's, as you can see, is in the millions of dollars. So we're trying to find that balance, but even if you sextupled the fees at the airport, it still would not be enough to cover the capital cost.
Okay, thank you. No, I appreciate that. And let me just restate just to make sure I've got this. So basically you're saying that we don't, because we're a smaller recreational facility, there's not enough users to pay for the capital improvements that we would need to make just with user fees if we were just to kind of do it that way.
That is correct. And that's why the study leaned towards developments.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And then my last question is just around, I know there's potentially some conversations around negotiations with the folks who wrote the ballot measures that are going on right now. What's the interaction, if any, between this conversation that we're having tonight and any negotiation that's happening with the petitioners and the ballot measures?
Nuria, would you like to take that one?
Sure. And actually, I'll invite Chris because he has been super instrumental on that. And before I do that, I'll just say we've started and had some good conversations. We've shared some of the concerns we heard and some that we have, but maybe Chris can add a little more texture to that.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Nuria. And great question, Nicole. Essentially, these two conversations are kind of happening in parallel. And it's just a little bit based on kind of the timing of where we're at. But for the petitions that have been submitted, we've been having some really good conversations with the committee and the committee's representative. And part of what we've been able to share a little bit is, at least from a staff perspective, some of the areas of the petition language as it was proposed, some concerns around kind of that balance of administrative versus legislative language. And so we've been having some great back and forth conversations on those and areas where we're understanding kind of perspectives. And so I think those conversations are still continuing, but they've been really productive so far.
Oh, I see Teresa has her hand up.
Teresa?
Thank you. As a procedural matter, the interaction between the conversations that are happening with the petitioner and the conversation you're having tonight is that should you all have a compromise measure come before you, that council would need to make a decision about whether council wants to put that on the ballot. And so so if, for example, a compromise were reached about the first ballot measure, which speaks to decommissioning the airport, council would then be faced with the decision about whether council wants to put that on the ballot as a council measure. And so just wanted to make that clear.
Thanks for the clarification, Teresa. Nicole, was that everything you had?
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to try to restate what Teresa just said, if that's okay, just to make sure I understand. So Teresa, you're basically, is it that if we are, if there is some sort of negotiated measure that comes through, our choice or not to put it on the ballot measure is kind of a choice in one direction or another along these scenarios tonight, or a little different? Sorry, I know I don't want to put you in a spot where you're trying to give legal advice in a public meeting either, so.
Sure, it's still a little speculative at this point. But if you were to be in a position where you are where you are given a compromise measure that speaks to decommissioning the airport, you all would have to make a decision that you want that on the ballot as a council.
Okay.
That answer the question?
Yes, yeah, no, it does. Thank you. Appreciate all the clarifications tonight. Thank you, folks.
Great. I've got Tara, Matt, Taisha, Mark, Ryan.
Well, that really threw a monkey wrench in things, Teresa. No, I'm kidding. I didn't even know about that. Okay, so most of my questions are actually asked and answered, but I'm going to start with John. Do you remember when 2.5 years ago, John Kinney, Rachel and I had a meeting? Is he still here? Had a meeting. Or did he leave?
He's here.
I'm here.
Remember when we
Just got
hung
him
out
running off.
together? That was so much fun. Okay, so I have a question. My first question is about the cracks, the pictures that you showed. What, that doesn't look like it happened last year or 2 years ago. I assume that it's been deteriorating for a while, or did that just happen?
No, that's over a period of time. Those are substantive cracks for an airport.
Okay, so why, forgetting about this ballot measure even or any of this, why, I'm just curious, why was maintenance deferred for so long? And why was that ignored to the point of now we have to spend millions of dollars or what have you? I'm just curious, and I'm not blaming anybody, and definitely not you. I'm just asking for a friend.
Yeah, it was before my time, so I can't address all the variables that are in play, but clearly the facilities at this airport have been ignored for an extended period of time.
And you don't know why though?
For, for I
So I can try to jump in on this one. So there was a, you could call it a financial strategy in deferring maintenance because there were limited revenues with the airport fund. And the needs were greater than the revenues that were coming in. And so there was the strategy for decades was to kind of do the bare minimum that I guess wasn't really even meeting, the minimum. And what we focused on was the runway did have a big CIP project a few years ago. And so that saw through FAA grants, that saw some improvements, but a lot of the pavement issues out at the airport are areas in which you can't use federal and state grants to improve the pavement. It needs to be off of, city generated or the airport fund dollars. And there were just not enough revenues to be able to maintain all of the infrastructure. And so that's the state of things.
Right, but John, do you remember when you said that the rental fees, the hangar rent fees were low and they were being late being paid and there were no landing fees? So it seems like everything possible was done to make this a mismanaged airport, or just, I mean, I don't understand why none of those things happen and now we have to pay for the brunt, why we have to suffer right now. I mean, it does, or should we just say that's life and move on and just,
unfortunately, you're changing the oil on this car for the first time at 80,000 miles. So the oil change will no longer address the issues that we have. And so preventative maintenance in a lot of the areas is no longer an option. It's the more expensive, which can be anywhere from 5 to 10 times the amount greater than that of preventative maintenance. So it's reconstruction, rehabilitation that we're finding ourselves in. City manager's office made it very clear when I was hired, restore a business acumen and run it more like a business, because they detected that there was a lot of unpaid bills. There was a lot of loose lease administration. There was a tremendous amount of kind of doing what was convenient as opposed to what was safe. A couple of years ago, you had some extraordinarily concerning behaviors out here that are now turning around, and people are being more of a partner with us, which is awesome. So I think we're making a lot of progress, but the damage to the pavement has been done, and so it's limited options. The more expensive ones are what's really at our disposal at this time, unfortunately. And those are engineers' assessments. That's not a administrative staff assessment.
for sure, you'd wonder why they would defer maintenance. Didn't anybody ever hear of inflation? But okay, moving on. So the 18-year scenario 2, call me negative Nelly, but I'm going to agree with, I think it was Tina. Why would somebody spend money to lease for 18 years on, and it can only be aviation related, correct? So can you just, somebody explain to me, when you talk about lease relief, which sounds really scary, by the way, what, that doesn't sound like it's a great idea. So tell me, what does that exactly mean? Are we going to be paying for people's leases paying for whatever buildings they build, or do you have any time to go into a little more detail, or do you want to do that at a different time?
Yeah, I think we can quickly speak to that. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So we have the grant obligations that are still in play with the FAA, and their expectation is that we will operate the airport, maintain the facilities safely. In doing so, that comes back to your capital plan. That comes back to the pavement condition and a variety of other capital components that make the airport safe. So it's an induced overhead in which we are now trying to catch up on and address now so that the expenses, even 2 or 3 years down the road, are not exponentially greater. But the only way to address that induced overhead is you either raise rents, rates, and fees, but a lot of the leases are fixed, so you have to offer some type of incentive to have the discussion to open the lease up, and that usually comes with extending the terms. And I'm so sorry I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, so did I.
on
Don't worry, it always happens to me.
that. So you have to, I got it back. So you have to, one of your most effective options is to develop, because that will bring you the greatest revenue. But as you astutely have pointed out, and other council members, who's going to put in $2, $3, $4 million to build a hangar where they need 25 to 30 to 35 to 40 years to amortize it properly? So unless you offer some type of long-term lease that makes a business sense for them to be able to amortize the investment of building that hangar and start the revenue flow into the airport coffers, so that you then can use those revenues to address the capital obligations to the FAA, that's a formula that you need. And lease relief is an element of that, meaning if you were going to spend $3 million to build a hangar, you would want some type of lease relief to say, look, I'll put up the $3 million, but by the time I design it, get the approvals, it's probably closer to less than 15 years remaining, which makes it even more challenging. You're going to be asking for some type of lease relief at the end of that 15 years so that you're not holding a $3 million amortization schedule. So if we don't provide you some type of financial incentive or relief from building that and giving us that revenue stream, the likelihood of anyone wanting to build at the airport is probably extremely low.
Oh, I'll save my comments for later. I have one more question. Why, why, I don't understand why there seems to be some thought that we would get 100% buy-in in scenario 2, that there would be a market for a private investment in scenario 2. I can't, what is is there evidence that I know, who was it that was pressing that we should do public-private partnership for scenario 2? Is there evidence that there is actually a market for this in scenario 2? Or is that just a hope and a dream? I'm just curious, and I don't mean it sarcastically.
No, it's a great question. Natalie, I don't know if you want to engage Kurt on that, who has kind of a
And that's it for me. That's my
regional
last.
perspective on that, or if you.
Yeah, it would be great to hear from Kurt. I don't know that he was promoted to panelist, so we may want to come back to that if he can join us to speak to it. And Kurt has some experience just nationally with general aviation airports and potential for development. And he could probably speak to what the possibility would be in the case of a lawful closure on the horizon. It looks like he is with us now and he's popping on. So, Kurt, did you hear that question?
I did get it as I was switching over. I lost a little bit. If you don't mind repeating it, that would be helpful.
Do you want to repeat it, Tara?
Gosh, it was hard enough to say it the first time.
Well, I'm happy to, Kurt.
You.
So Tara's just curious about just the likelihood of, in that scenario 2, when we would, pursue lawful closure in 18 years, is there really any likelihood for private development? If we were to offer lease relief, is there any likelihood of any market demand?
I
I think
know
the
that there
question,
would be, that wasn't my question. Of
Oh.
course, if we're gonna pay people to, of course, that would take advantage of it. No, that definitely, that's not my question. I guess during the presentation, there was a lot of excitement by the presentee that we should do like the 100% public-private partnership. I can't even imagine that is there evidence that there is 100% private partnership market interest. I mean, that's a whole lot, 100% private partnership. I don't see how there's a world that there would be that, but I can run on the negative. So
and sorry, you're asking under either scenario, correct? Is that just the industry, I think is your question? Is that correct?
no, that's just for two.
Okay, thank you.
So if I may, and Mayor Brockett, it's a pleasure to be here in the committee. I have been following along and listening, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about this one topic. Public-private partnerships in private airport development at an airport like this, it often is very typical because the industry is bringing the money and the airport's bringing the opportunity and the land for private development to come in and invest. And so I think in either scenario, the risk that you have is that you have an airport that's discussing potential closure, and the interest in the development community is going to be skeptical of making investment in development and regardless of what type of use. John mentioned that, the airport is focused on recreational use. So the likelihood of, large, private aircraft is unlikely. You might have small recreational type businesses, and John named a few when he talked about it in the slide presentation, maintenance operators, flight schools, and things like that. If you were to offer rent relief, and it's a very hard thing to estimate because you're not only going to be, discussing possibly relief for their unamortized portion of their project, but if they're a commercial operation, they're going to possibly wanting some, relief relative to their commercial investment that they are going to lose with the remaining years that they may have had left if the airport had remained open. And so I think, testing the market through either negotiations or requests for proposals or requests for information, if people were going to invest in certain developments, might yield some information of the willingness. But it seems unlikely that, as from a background of doing development, I would be really skeptical to want to come into an airport and invest, significant dollars with the thought that it was going to be taken away and or possibly my cost purchase, because a lot of these folks that are here are there for either private aircraft storage or again small business interest, and so I think that is somewhat of an uphill battle.
Okay, just to be clear, it was really kind of a rhetorical question. Like, obviously, the answer you gave was the obvious answer. So my real question was really not a question. It was, why in the world will we spend so much time talking about this thing that could is never going to happen? But I'll just leave it at that and let the next person come.
Okay. Thanks, Tina. And so as we move forward, I'll just note to folks that we only have half an hour in our originally allotted time for this. So if I can encourage council members to be focused in your questions and for staff to be brief in your answers. Thanks so much. We got Matt, Taisha, Mark, Ryan, Tina.
Appreciate it. A couple questions. I think hopefully my question can help sort of reconcile what seems to be some differences between how we what may seem like we formulate our master plan in a vacuum. And so my question is, does the FAA retain a sort of sign-off / approval authority with regards to our master planning process as a function of having these grant assurances with the FAA?
John or Steve, do one of you want to take that one?
Let's have Steve.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Ossett with Kaplan Kirsch Outside Aviation Council for the city. The FAA frequently funds master plans. If they fund a master plan, the master plan needs to be executed in accordance with FAA guidance. But ultimately, they accept a master plan. They do not approve a master plan. Now, that said, one element of the master plan is the generation of an airport layout plan, which is a map that you've all probably seen before, which depicts, existing and future facilities. That is a document that the FAA approves.
Okay, so that's helpful. So I just appreciate it because that helps maybe reconcile a little bit of what maybe our master planning isn't just a document that's just done unto ourselves. There is the FAA has hand in it in one form or the other. Appreciate that clarification. The other question I have has to do with in this process, have we done any sort of direct comparisons with airports that serve similar size communities and are thus of similar size? Just to get a sense of where does that sort of capital investment compare and or operations, the scale of what type of aircraft are coming in or the volume of flights? Are there any comparable ones out there? Just so we and our community just get a sense of where are we? Are we in the middle tier or higher, below average? Just curious.
John, go ahead and speak to that one. We have done some just kind of peer review around like operations and uses. So John can speak to that.
Yeah, Matt, as part of the Aeroplex report, there's several comparisons of, I think, 10 or 12 airports of like type size, but most of them are out of state. So we also then asked the consultants to roll in like Centennial and Erie and Longmont and Rocky Mountain. I think most of those made it in there. Yes, those comparisons were made.
Thank you. It's just helpful to have that out there. And the last question is, I appreciate staff acknowledging the couple points that I brought up in my hotline about the environmental remediation costs that are going to be there, as well as the assumption that closing the airport doesn't mean we're just going to let it lay fallow, and that there's going to be something we're going to do with it. And then if the city retains any sort of ownership, there's going to be some development costs that either we or a developer would have to assume. And with that, my ask would be that if we continue down any more financial analysis, would it be possible to sort of hire a real estate development consultant? Because I think to really understand the true cost of going down closure and ultimately doing something with it, we kind of need to know what that looks like. And that is part of a financial analysis from which to understand the actual true costs of what closing the airport would be, because it's final, right? Closing the airport isn't like we get to then we in 30 years we could open another one up. It ends the story of an airport in Boulder forever. And so really knowing the true costs as we run out would be helpful. So a development consultant would be something I think that would be really helpful to understand those costs. So hopefully that's something that we could embark on if we continue going down this financial analysis path.
Do we have a question
That's
there?
it. I saw a nod, so that's good enough for me if I saw a nod. I appreciate that's all my questions.
Great. Taisha, Mark, Ryan, and I got one.
Awesome. I almost was going to on Matt's thing around, but again, a point of clarification in all seriousness around, so if the FFA has the authority to approve something, what does that also give them the authority to do? Not approve it. So I just want to clarify that if they have the authority to approve, they also have the authority not to approve. But for my questions, I had a few around, and I'll make them all quick, and then you can answer them in order or however you want. One question was if energy generation was considered as a revenue generating opportunity for any of the scenarios listed. Number two, I noticed that in 2021, the runway was repaved, and I believe around 90% of the pavement, was my understanding, is still in good use. And so although I appreciate all of the deferred maintenance, and I've had the opportunity to tour that area myself, and the hangars are deplorable, I also would love to just get some real costs around things. So I had some questions about that. Number three is around if you build it, they will come category, which is to say, if we are trying to keep this airport small and neighborhood, as you indicated, John, then why are we considering anything that would allow class two engines which to me is really jets, which is private jets, which is louder. And again, to Nicole's question of how, because we the city does not have the authority to determine who gets to use the airport, but we can incentivize who gets to use it based on how we design it. And so when we have any kind of renewals, and this is where my concern is around scenario number 2 or 1B or whatever, the one that allows for the class 2 and also whatever it is that allows the planes to operate when the weather's bad. Though both of those things are indicators of a bigger airport, not maintaining or making our current airports more efficient. So my question is, since the request was how to maintain it at its current thing, I'm wondering how the decision was made to actually create offerings that would actually go against that original request and incentivize fancy hangars, right? That fancy people will pay a whole lot of money, even though it's only going to last us 20 years. And so that's another big question that I have. And then lastly, can you please clarify the use of our airport? Because right now, when you say majority, it sounds like nothing else happens outside of recreation. But you all and I know that other things happen like science and education. So I just wanted to confirm that in addition to the majority of our airport currently being used for recreation, that there are aspects that significantly contribute to science and education concerns. So those are my 4 questions.
John, do you want to take all of those? Did you catch them?
Sure. In terms of the scientific aviation component, yes, we definitely have a robust presence here. One is Neon Aviation, who does mapping of all North and South America and shares that data with anyone and everyone who is interested. They have aircraft here about 4 months out of the year, and the rest of the year they're.
John, that's plenty of information on that one. I just wanted to confirm that other science-related things outside of recreation are happening on site. So you got that one. What about education?
And I'll just pile in, John, just to keep those short answers, please.
That's why that's why I was like, do we have this? Yes, no. Do we have that? Yes, no.
Energy generation was not considered.
Okay.
Runway 8 was resurfaced in 2021. Anticipate in 2026 it's going to be some type of preventative maintenance. If you build it, will they come? Private jets, they're here today. You can't.
Yes, I know, but they're not. But what we can do, but what you have done is incentivize. So my question is in that second scenario, would that scenario incentivize more private jet usage because we will have had facilities that will accommodate those, even in the weighting of the weight of the runway can ascertain.
So I think on that one, and we can follow up, but I think that one, I'm a little bit confused because for scenario 1, we're just, the CIP is consistent with the 2007 master plan. And in scenario 2, there's no assumption that we would be incentivizing large aircraft like jets.
But when I guess what I'm saying is when we increase and depend more on private, right? There is going to, the question is what is the market going to allow? And so my question is, were private jets considered in the analysis of how we are doing these updates? The impacts of the users, will we rather, will that attract kind of?
Yeah, we don't expect so because of the constraints of the facility. So the length of the runway and the lack of precision GPS, we don't expect that those types of uses would come.
But with the current plane that we have now, but as E-planes and others expand and the technology advances, would there be a potential? So that's the question.
That's a good question. Yeah, we can.
And it's not for now
as we move forward.
Thank you, appreciate that.
In terms of your last questions, in terms of a precision approach of the runway end identifier lights, staff has not pursued either one of those in the last multiple years. That's a state recommendation we have not pursued.
Awesome, thank you, John.
Great, thanks so much, Mark and Ryan.
Okay, just one question. In my previous hotline, and this applies to both scenarios 1 and 2. I asked if we had looked at any alternative financing mechanisms to bridge the gap between revenues and expenses, and that could include use of the infrastructure tax, certificates of participation, bonds, land loans, some drawdown from reserves. Have we looked at any of that? And do we intend to look at any of that?
We have not looked at that yet. I think those are all things that if there's additional study that's desired, and I see Cara jumping on, but Cara, feel free to chime in here. But to my knowledge, we have not looked at that yet.
Good evening, Council. Cara Skinner, Chief Financial Officer. I did just want to share that I did talk with our municipal advisors, and sort of issuing debt or traditional municipal finance options really, I don't think solve a problem here. We would just be issuing debt and having to have debt service payments instead of funding, coming up with some other maintenance or capital funding source along the way. So I don't know if traditional municipal finance solutions would work. Certainly, we can consider a general fund or CCRS, but of course that's trade-off discussions. I mean, there's other needs and uses for those dollars, and so council would simply have to make that a priority use of those dollars. Your ideas in terms of that are more like a reverse mortgage type of concept, I think it was Matt's suggestion that we would need to consult with a real estate development consultant. That's really real estate transaction. We haven't investigated those yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have one question about understanding our control over the airport and its impacts in a way that we haven't fully talked about. And I'll ask it as a scenario. So let's assume that the direction that follows from today and the vote in November leads to greater investments in the airport for capacity and signals that create an increased demand for air traffic, both in terms of volume and perhaps in terms of size of aircraft. So let's say that both happens. And then the community decides that is not what we want, that's problematic for whatever reasons. Maybe there's something happens for whatever reason. We have enhanced levels of this traffic. We then, as a community, say we don't want this anymore. Do we have a practical ability to contain and then reduce heightened volumes of air traffic? I guess that's sort of about what's practical. Do we have something we can do that's practical? Is it legal? It's such that we might do with transportation on the ground. You have a toolkit of transportation demand management. I'll leave it at that. That's my question. Thank you.
Steve, do you want to take this one?
Sure. The short answer is no, you do not have that authority. There's a variety of federal laws and your grant assurance obligations, which, number one, restrict you from imposing any sort of a restriction on access to the airport in terms of, a curfew or a limit on the number of operations. There is a mechanism to submit those types of requests for restriction to the FAA. Those laws have been in place for 34 years, and nobody has obtained approval from the FAA to impose that sort of restriction. And the way that the FAA has administered those laws makes it extraordinarily unlikely that you would ever receive permission to impose that type of an operational quota. As John alluded to earlier, you also presumably would be under a continuing grant assurance obligation to provide access to the airport on reasonable and not unjustly discriminatory terms. You're not allowed to restrict any class of aeronautical user. So you couldn't say only small planes, only large planes, only non-commercial traffic, or anything like that. So unfortunately, the short answer is you have little control over restricting operational capacity moving forward. That said, you do have control over how the airport develops, the types of facilities that are being built, what's being prioritized, which has an indirect effect on the types of operations, but you can't directly regulate that in that area.
Thank you.
Right, and I have one question, which is, so we're talking about financial analysis here tonight, and there have been some questions asked about remediation. Thanks for the response to that earlier today, Natalie. One area that I haven't seen possible numbers attached to is in the scenario 2, where we're pursuing lawful closure of the airport. I imagine there would be legal costs involved. I know those would be very uncertain, but Teresa, I'm going to look to you. Do you have a sense of a very rough range of what kind of costs we might be looking at in that scenario 2?
I'm afraid I don't. That's certainly something we can look into and get back to you about.
I would appreciate that. Thanks. Okay, that looks like all of our questions here. So now we're going to move forward to feedback from council. We have the memo covered scenarios 1 and 2, but I do want to note that there was a hotline with a kind of combined proposal from Mark and Matt about a possible third option, which would be to not weigh in and pick scenario 1 or 2, and particularly because we have a ballot measure on the table with an approved number of signatures where the voters are going to weigh in on precisely this question here in November. So there's this idea of not selecting the scenario tonight, going through the election processes, and then coming back to these questions after the voters have weighed in. I've gotten a sense that there may be council support for that approach, so I wanted to start by putting that on the table and maybe taking a straw poll to see if people might be interested in going more that kind of a route. But if people have a couple quick comments before we get to that, that's welcome as well. I got Mark and Nicole.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that very briefly. I hope briefly. There is so much information that we don't have. And Matt and I come at this from very opposite points of view. And I think he was as dissatisfied with the descriptions in scenario 1 as I was in scenario 2. And so we're just not getting the analysis that we think we need. And I'll speak to scenario 2 because I'm a little more interested in that. I don't think there's anybody who contemplated closure of the airport and sale of all of the land at fair market value. I think people think of it in terms of, if I'm going to go through all of this effort and expense to do this, I'd like to get some community benefit in terms of middle market housing or affordable housing. And so I think we need to refine these analyses a little more and maybe refine some of the premises. And so I am in support of what my colleague has drafted. And I think this is one of those times when it's better to step back, take a breath, and let's look at this going forward. We're not in a particular rush. If we choose scenario 2, we're still going to have an airport for 18 years. If we choose scenario 1, we still have a lot of work to do to refine what that would look like and how we would want that. And I don't think there's a rush for either. And so I want to speak in support of that hotline proposal, and I endorse it entirely.
Thanks, and Nicole and then Tina, and then maybe I'll try a straw poll.
Yeah, and this I think just goes back to my question that Teresa had weighed in on too, around how this overlaps with the ballot measures. So we will be discussing next month putting measures on the ballot, and because these 2 measures related to the airport and future uses were petition-driven measures, we have the option, if I'm remembering correctly from last year, of putting the original, just kind of not doing anything, the original petition measures go on, of putting a competing measure on, or of with the negotiations that are happening, of having something that is more of a something that we've both contributed to, the petition group and council. And what I heard Teresa say before is that that is a choice point, that is us making a choice. And so I don't know if we can actually kick this down the road until after the voters weigh in, though I'm very eager to hear, what the community is interested in. It feels like that process of deciding whether we will take action or not is a choice point. And so I guess just, I don't know if there's any more clarity there to offer, Teresa. I just want to make sure that, if we're deciding to wait a little bit, we can actually do that. And rather than the ballot measures and how we're responding to that being a choice.
Do you mind if I offer a thought on that, Nicole? Because it's an excellent point. I mean, we will have a decision point next month. You're absolutely right, between those three choices, and that third choice of a compromise measure may or may not come together because there may or may not be interest in doing something like that. I will say that, and so we'll have to tackle that choice when it comes to us. It is its own distinct choice, which is a little different from saying we should keep the airport open or we should do everything we can to close it. But you're absolutely right. We'll have to wrestle with that.
And it's still like, this is where, I'm curious about if we are choosing to put a compromise measure on, is that us signaling a choice to move in that direction? Does that make sense? Right? Like, is that where is, and this may be for offline legal kinds of discussion, but that sort of, it feels like a choice point to me in terms of what we're deciding about the airport's future.
I think it's an important thing to keep in mind as we move to that decision point, that question. Tina.
Yeah, and thank you for putting out the proposal, Mark and Matt. I'm also interested in not weighing in tonight. But one of the reasons I'm not interested in weighing in is because, and I want to just appreciate how we got here, that this conversation started with a different council about a year ago and is responding to a financial analysis at the end of the day. However, our two choices, one of which is to stop taking grants, if with the intent of decommissioning the airport, this doesn't feel like a direction to me, but a decision. And I think it's important that if we make a decision like that, we have a process that does include a public open comment, and go through that process. So this is a big decision from my point of view. And so I prefer also delaying and also adding to that the fact that we have a ballot measure. And whether it's a choice point for us, I do think it will be a choice point for our community. And it looks, I would imagine there'll be some kind of ballot issue on the ballot regardless. So that would be my preference. I have one clarification about the Wallach-Benjamin proposal. Right now in that, would we be pursuing development? Development is in both proposals. Would we be considering that development opportunities would be pursued in the interim, or would we not be pursuing those?
So I can respond to the intent of the hotline. One of the key pieces is that it was very clear that there was work that needed to be done as strategies and elements as stated in the staff memo, and delaying this wouldn't hinder that work. But I think it's pretty clear that in the coming months, we're not going to see a new hangar built. So I think that there's, for lack of better words, we have plenty of runway from which to meet those needs and allow staff to kind of get moving. And more discussion will occur, but I don't think that in a delay it made sense to delay our decision or choice to also then pause continued staff work on either financial analysis and or what's in their strategies and elements. So it was a way to kind of give staff what they needed to continue to move forward. But that was the intent of it. But I can't imagine that any of that bigger stuff would be occurring in the short time frame that's in front of us before it comes back to us.
If I can,
Thank you.
if I can colloquy on that.
Go ahead.
My participation in this was on the understanding that we're basically not deciding these big decisions today. We're not going to be building hangars tomorrow. There are a number of things that are going to happen. I would urge staff to continue to plan for either scenario in a different way, because and we can get into that at a later time, because I think there were a number of defects in how we approach this. But my understanding is that, no, we're not going to be building hangars tomorrow. We're going to continue analysis. We're not going to decide tonight, and we're going to see how things unfold after taking a deep breath.
So it would include continued analysis through the election, but not construction or the taking of additional grants,
Absolutely.
I think is the intent.
Yes.
Well, and I would say that is accurate from staff's perspective, that the consequence of allowing us to preserve a decision at a later point means that we will not currently seek additional grants now, which we don't need to do to continue to comply right now with our current obligations with the FAA. But there is work to be done on the work plan, and that work will continue, right? And so that will move forward. But knowing the FAA's now current position and the current place that we find ourselves in wanting to explore more research and get some additional information, we would not want to put ourselves in a position of binding ourselves in one way or another. And so administratively, we would not right now be seeking any further FAA grant support, because that could have some consequences in the future that we do not wish right now to incur. But we fully intend to continue to comply with our existing obligations.
Thanks for the clarification. Taisha?
Thank you. I echo, I don't feel, I'm feeling a full sense of urgency around having to make a decision around anything this evening without the following pieces of information. One, the mitigation cost of transitioning a property to anything other than its current use. The finalized housing study, which Nicole, thank you for your hotline request and offer to discuss and take us through that, and having some more specifics around the infill possibilities as well as the other areas. Number three, the litigation costs, estimated litigation costs. And then number four, I would love to see an exploration of energy generation and just a consideration and conversations around that. So I just feel like we don't have, and this is what my concern is, even with the ballot measures at hand. I'm hopeful that some of that information can be made available prior to the election vote and prioritize that information. I have some concerns around the $400,000 million profit component there. And yeah. So I'm just hopeful that we can get some more meaningful data to inform the voters in the conversation, et cetera. But those are the specific feelings that I don't feel comfortable in weighing in today. Thank you.
Thanks, Taisha. Nicole, another thought?
Yeah, sorry, just one more clarification. Nuria, as you were talking, we still have FAA obligations that we need to fulfill. And if we're not doing that with grants, the only scenario, the only thing that I saw was this, continuing this path of new development, right? Or, at what point do we start taking from the city? Right, do we see that for next year's, for this budget we're gonna be working on in a couple months? Is it the year after? Like, we have obligations to fulfill, and money doesn't grow on trees. Definitely not.
Certainly know that.
So.
Certainly know that. And maybe I'll defer to John and Natalie. It depends on what we define as meeting, like, right, we have to meet our obligations as we move forward. There are some improvements that we need to do. There, frankly, some enhancements that I think we'd like to pursue, like continuing to look at unleaded fuel. We've mentioned that in some of the work that moves forward. All of that comes at a cost. And so the ability to do that at what level, at what pace, will be dependent on what funding source we're able to do. So that is a reality, and we will have to go back and take a look at what that looks like. It is certainly not our intention, knowing that we are currently continuing to consider the future land use potential in 18 years of the site, not wanting to invest city dollars in a wholesale expansion of airport in ways that we don't know what the future of that of the site will be, but we have work to do. We have some maintenance to do. We have some repairs to do. And we certainly would like to continue to think about ways in which we can continue to do noise abatement, some of the great work that's been done currently to consider unleaded fuel. And that will cost time and resources and money. And so, John and Natalie, if you've
Yeah.
got additional thoughts, welcome.
I think you covered most of it, Nuria, and I would just add that, on that work plan item slide, we did identify there are other strategies that we would like to move forward on. And rents and fees methodology updates will be part of that, including landing fees. And so there are other revenue strategies on the work plan that we can move forward with. And, as Karen pointed out, the, fund balance for the airport is at, I think, 1.7. At least that's what we use for the analysis. So there's obviously some reserves there for us to tap into as we go forward. But, as there will be a time at which we need to have that conversation as a city, on the near horizon about using other city funds to just continue to operate the airport.
Thanks for that, Nuria and Natalie. And I will note that if we're waiting until after the election, we're going to be hearing from the voters in 3.5 months. So, we would be able to come back and discuss further in the not too distant future based on the outcome of the ballot measure.
I would have two things, Mayor, if I can, about it. I would just, I go to John's lovely analogy. What was it about not putting oil in a vehicle, that the longer we go without proper investment, financial investment, right, the more we're going to have to think about that down the road. But that's one thing. Perhaps more importantly, and this is a question a little bit to staff, I know that there is a desire for more answers and to have more conversation about it. I guess, Teresa, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if we have a petition on the table, we have a go dark period, and staff will not be able to respond to some or have conversations about some of this after September 5th, I believe is the date. So there will be time that we will not be able to have some discussions. And I worry, and so Natalie, perhaps I turn to you, I worry about staff's capacity to be able to get some of the very, very detailed questions you want answered between now and that go dark period. So I just want to set expectations that we may not have all the answers that you were looking for in the next 4 weeks.
I think that's very accurate.
Point taken. All right, so I'd like to go ahead and gauge council's interest here. So we have this option on the table to not choose a scenario 1 or 2, but instead wait until after the results of the ballot measure. While we have some questions out on the table that staff will be able to answer probably some, but not all of, before we get to that go dark period. And also keeping in mind, we'll be coming to the question of the ballot measure when we put it on in a few weeks. But are people comfortable? How many people are interested in deferring the final decision until after the ballot measure? Please raise your physical hand. I got, let's see, everybody who's on camera has raised their hand. Taisha, did you want to weigh in there? Okay, very good. So that's a unanimous on that.
Sorry about that, Aaron. I thought I was on camera, so I had my hand up that whole time, and I was like, "What do you mean?"
No worries. Okay, so I think we've talked this through. We've had a lot of great questions, and we've got some good clarifications from staff. And I think this also means that when we come back after the ballot measure, that will be a good time to talk through again some more of the assumptions and possibilities depending on the path that the airport is going down. Does anyone have any burning final thoughts from council before I turn to final thoughts from staff? Not seeing any. I'll just offer a thanks to Mark and Matt for putting that together. That was helpful.
No, absolutely.
Nuria,
Yes.
Any clarifications that you'd like or from us or final thoughts?
No, I guess I defer. I want to make sure that Natalie and her team has everything they need. I know there's some follow-ups that we committed to, and we'll make sure to get those fairly soon. And I know that there are some questions that perhaps are more in the legal vein that I know Teresa and her team will be following up with you on. But if they don't have any clarifications, I think we're clear.
Natalie?
We're good.
Okay. Thanks so much. I know you staff, you all did an enormous amount of work to get this packet put together, lots of detailed analysis, and the discussion continues. We'll stay in suspense for a while longer here, but deeply appreciate all of your work. Taisha?
Are we about to close? Because
We
I
are.
wanted to get in before you get, because you know, y'all are fast to close a meeting. So I got to get in there before you close the meeting. And I just wanted to say thank you. It was so wonderful to come back home and come back uptown and see flowers planted by the Arboretum sign. So I just wanted to acknowledge and say thank you for.
Wait, what? That's great
You know,
news.
there's flowers in there and they like fixed the median so it looks like something's gonna happen. And I just wanted to it was nice to come home and see that done. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Working on that connection strategy on the priorities. We're getting there.
And then on a more serious note, I want to thank Interim Chief Redfern. I had a conversation with him about our hiring protocols after hearing about the tragedy that happened in the murder of Sine Massey, who was shot in the face, unfortunately of no cause of hers, and the officer who at question allegedly or whatever was at 6 different police departments. And so I just put a call in to say, hey, I just want to double check that we don't allow people who have a pattern to, we have protocols to make sure that we don't have people with histories of domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was just really happy to hear that it most certainly is not our protocol, and we have strict policies in place to prevent something like that. And then lastly, of course, the North Sky Trail opening. And I just want to take a moment to also thank our Indigenous and our tribal ancestral stores who make it possible for us to even discuss it. And I'm hopeful that in the design of this North Sky Trail, which was a balance of ecological, cultural, user groups, that this is the direction we need to be moving in. So thank you so much. But I did want to specifically lift up both our ancestral stores, and I'm eager to again ensure that we are continuing to figure out meaningful ways to atone for the stolen land that we have the opportunity to live on, and heal relationships with our Indigenous and tribal communities. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Taisha. And it is lovely kudos. And just to clarify, we are done with our airport item. So if anybody has some final thoughts, so John, appreciate everything. Natalie and the rest of the staff, thanks so much for being here and all your work there.
Thank you.
And then before we wrap it up entirely, any other final thoughts on the meeting, Ryan?
Just one closing comment. I want to express gratitude to Natalie and the Transportation Mobility team and Allison for the incredible depth and breadth of work that they are taking forward. This airport process on its own is gargantuan. I was a part of it as a Transportation Advisory Board meeting, and had the pleasure to watch Allison run that just with great diligence. But this same team is working on the Iris Avenue bikeway, and we've got transportation enhancement policy coming up in a few weeks. And I just wanted to thank the team for just doing an enormous amount of work right now that is very important for the community. So thank you.
Well said. All right, well, we're ending almost on time. Thanks everybody for great questions and a good discussion tonight. Elisha, we got anything else, or we're at the end of our agenda?
No, sir, that's the end of the agenda.
Okay, very good. Well, welcome back everybody to meeting times, and have a lovely evening and take care of yourselves. Gavel's closed at 9:13 p.m. Good night.